About an hour after the first strike in New York, a plane crashed into the Pentagon, collapsing one side of the building. Another plane crashed in Pennsylvania. The White House was evacuated. The president, who was in Florida, was rushed to a secure location.
Hundreds of people who were aboard the planes that crashed. The death toll from this day could be in the thousands.
8:45 a.m., New Yorkers were arriving at work, picking up a bagel or a cup of coffee on the way, when today's first wave of calamitous news was announced. Newscasters reached for precedent. 60 years ago, a plane had crashed into the Empire State Building. People watched on television, and they also watched through the windows of apartments and office buildings that faced downtown, and then they saw the event repeated at the second tower. It will no doubt be days before all the black boxes are retrieved and all the dead and injured are accounted for. It will certainly be a lot longer than that before the people who were in downtown Manhattan this morning ever forget this experience. NPR's Melissa Block was near the World Trade Center and is with me now. Melissa, if one had to pick a place in the United States or in New York as dense with people as you possibly could, it would be at the World Trade Center.
Lower Manhattan, and thousands of people coming to work in this congested area, and many of whom, as you mentioned, saw exactly what happened. I spoke with a worker at a construction site just north of the World Trade Center named Murray Goff. They were there. He had just flown in yesterday from West Virginia to work on this site. He was standing there at his work site, and he hears one jet flying low overhead.
And we heard it go over, and we looked up, and then we heard the crash. Run out here and looked and seen the plane where it went into the side. We're standing here, can't believe it, still looking at it. Whenever the second plane crashed through the smoke into the other one, well, as soon as I seen that plane hit, I said it's a terrorist attack. They better call Red Alert, all for federal buildings. I mean, that's the only thing it could be, because it came in right above us and just banked and went into the building.
It came in right over your head?
Yeah, right over here, just right over like that, and just banked. You could see it was an American airline. I didn't see the American airline, but some of the workers looked up and seen the plane and noticed it was an American Airlines.
And Red Alert or whatever, police instantly were called in, firefighters were called in, everyone was there.
Thousands, and the tragedy here is that firefighters and emergency personnel did what they're supposed to do. They responded to the scene, they rushed into those buildings after the planes crashed, and then there are expected to be many, many casualties of those workers who were there when the buildings collapsed on them. I spoke with a lieutenant from the Port Authority Police named Thomas Innes, who was covered with debris. He was basically muddy ash head to toe. He was there, he responded to the scene after the planes went into the building. He saw people jumping out of the towers from maybe 70 or 80 stories out there up above. There were reports of a man and a woman holding hands as they jumped from the building to try to escape, and he was there when the buildings came down.
I guess the scariest part was being covered in dust and not being able to see, and breathing through my hat.
You couldn't see anything?
No, you couldn't see anything. It was pitch black.
And you were breathing through your police hat?
My hat, yes, because that's all I had with me.
The people who were jumping, did you see them fall?
Unfortunately, yes. It's not something I would like to talk about, and unfortunately, it's not something I'll ever be able to forget about. At first, you thought it was pieces of the building falling, until you realized that they had arms and legs. And at this point, I really wouldn't want to say anything more about it.
The World Trade Center towers, which are now mostly rubble, where once there were these symbols of Lower Manhattan, are more than symbols. This is where people live their real workaday lives, where they take their children, and this is part of a big live city.
Absolutely. And everywhere you went today, you saw people looking at this cloud of smoke clustered around radios. People had car doors open with the radios blasting. People gathered around to hear what had happened. I spoke with one man. You also saw a lot of people rushing to pick up their kids from school and from daycare. I talked to Michael Ruddy, who was just picking up his son, his 6-year-old son, from school, and he mentioned that until last year, his wife worked at the World Trade Center. What did you tell your son?
Excuse me. I'm very emotional about this. I explained to him that something very terrible had happened, that the World Trade Center, which he knows very well, because he used to call it Mama's Building. I told him that it had been hit by an airplane and had now been destroyed, and it doesn't exist anymore. He's, I think, concerned because he sees how sad I am. He kind of sees the sadness.
A New Yorker who shared that experience earlier today with NPR's Melissa Block.
Here in Washington, less than an hour after the second plane crashed into the World Trade Center, a third aircraft sliced into the Pentagon. Dozens of people were sent to area hospitals. Many of the seats of power in the nation's capital, the White House, the Capitol, the Treasury, and State Departments were evacuated. And 2 hours later, United Airlines confirmed a fourth plane crash near Pittsburgh with no reports of survivors among the 45 on board. NPR's Peter Kenyon joins us now. Peter, let's back up to the crash at the Pentagon. What do we know about that so far?
Well, the initial reports were fairly sketchy, but after it soon became apparent that this was a very heavy hit that the building had taken, and the five-sided building, it was one side of it was just sliced from top to bottom. There was a huge gaping hole and a bright orange fireball, and one side of it had been punctured heavily. Just been some renovations there recently, which was in some ways a blessing because they'd put in blast-proof glass and things like that. But there was still a potential for very heavy injuries and possibly fatalities. Military officials said the fire was intense. Hospitals reported at least 40 victims, some in critical condition, 7 in critical as of mid-afternoon. It was apparently hard for rescue workers to get in there because of the heavy fire and smoke. There was a plane, an American Airlines plane of 64 people aboard. One FBI official on the scene said he believed that was the plane that suddenly veered off route and ran into the Pentagon.
So to be clear about it, a commercial airliner hits the Pentagon this morning.
That's right. Just right into it. Often there's a helicopter pad nearby, and it just went right in there.
Now, a lot of people in the nation's capital shocked it seemed to be an attack not just on the military at the Pentagon, but on the very symbol of the United States.
I think it was, and I think the fact that it came so soon in conjunction with the World Trade Center attacks that made it even more devastating for people. Rapid evacuation, as you mentioned at the top, of all of these buildings. And on any given day, you know, a lot of the people here in town are tourists, and those in front of the White House were being yelled at by agitated Secret Service agents. They didn't quite know what to do. Reporters were finding congressmen and senators hanging around on the lawn of the Capitol because they'd been evacuated. The president traveled from Florida to Louisiana, where he made a brief statement, and then on to Nebraska, where he convened a meeting of the National Security Council. And Karen Hughes today said she repeated his pledge that they would use every resource, first to help the victims and then to track down whoever's responsible for this.
We have 2 planes that hit the World Trade Center. We have 1 that hits the Pentagon. A 4th aircraft goes down near Pittsburgh.
That's right, and this was the hardest to connect, but there was an emergency call. Emergency official in the Pennsylvania area got a call from a passenger, a man who identified himself as a passenger, said he was in the bathroom of this plane, and he kept saying, "We've been hijacked, we've been hijacked." And he said this isn't a hoax. And then the dispatcher reportedly heard an explosion and lost contact with the caller. There's reportedly 45 people aboard that plane, and an emergency worker there in Pennsylvania said there were no sign of survivors.
Thank you, Peter. NPR's Peter Kenyon.
The planes involved in today's 4 deadly crashes were hijacked from airports in Newark, Washington, and Boston. Details of how airport security in those cities was so dramatically breached are not yet clear. But the hijackings mean routine security procedures from X-ray machines to employee background screening will be scrutinized for vulnerabilities. And there may be limits to how much protection Titan Security can offer. NPR's Emily Harris joins us now. Emily, what do we know about how these people managed to hijack these planes?
We know very little at the moment, Linda. That really is the question of the day. Security experts want to know exactly how teams managed to get into the airport. There's basically 2 ways that you can get to planes, either through the passenger side, and most people who have taken any sort of air travel are familiar with that. Go in, you show your ID, you answer a couple of questions about your baggage, and then go through a metal detector. The other way that planes are accessible are on the so-called ramp side. It's the people who work there, the cleaners, the food handlers, the baggage handlers, and the mechanics. And the very basic question that security officials want to find out is which side was breached for this terrorist attack.
And how hard would it be, do you suppose, to breach either side?
Well, security experts have been telling me that for something this scale, this coordinated, it would have taken a number of months of planning, either side. You've got to scope out the areas. You've got to find the vulnerabilities at the particular airports. There's a lot of speculation at this point going on among airline security people regarding how this happened. One person has suggested to me that whoever carried out this attack may have tried to stockpile weapons ahead of time on the secure side of the airport somehow and been able to access them quickly. this is a really big question right now. How did people get through, and what can be done to tighten security?
And what about people who were somehow able to control these planes over distance, flying them into specific targets?
That's actually fairly tough, according to some people I've talked to, and there seems to be consensus that the group that carried out this attack had trained pilots with them. Partially, people have told me they think that because they find it really hard to believe a pilot for United or American Airlines would fly his or her plane into the Pentagon or into the World Trade Center. It's one question that's definitely going to come out in this investigation is, when was it clear that these planes were off course, and what exactly did air traffic officials do at that point?
How much tighter could airline security get? Is there any indication? Emily, I think we're going to run out of time here, Emily, but yes or no, do we know when we're going to start flying again in this country?
Don't know. The earliest would be noon Eastern tomorrow.
Thanks very much, Emily Harris.
You're listening to special coverage from NPR News. I'm Noah Adams. A few hours ago, New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani gave reporters the latest information on injuries from today's terrorist attacks.
600 people that are being treated in local hospitals, and there are 150 in particular that were critical, that were moved by EMS. New York City has 170 hospitals, and we're utilizing all of them.
To bring us up to date on the extent of the casualties and injuries, we turn now to NPR's Rick Carr, who's in New York. Rick, I know people are very hesitant about doing this, but can you put any number yet on the number of estimated dead and injured in the city?
Well, beyond what we heard from Mayor Giuliani in that cut of tape, there's very little sense of it. Communication has been difficult in New York today, and the hospital workers have an awful lot on their hands, more important things than answering pesky reporters' questions. You know, Mayor Giuliani did say at that press conference that the number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear. There were about 1,500 people who arrived almost immediately after the two planes hit at a park in Lower Manhattan. They were the walking wounded. They were taken to area hospitals. The New York Police Department told the Associated Press earlier this afternoon that likely thousands of people are dead. 40 or 50,000 people work in the World Trade Center towers. The questions are, how many hadn't yet arrived to work? How many stayed away at the last minute? How many made it out of the building? We just don't know the answer to those questions.
And you're surveying the scope of the injuries at the hospitals in New York. How is that going?
Yeah, Mayor Giuliani says that all 170 of the hospitals in New York have been called into action. There's no sort of central number, but here's some examples. At St. Vincent's, which is the hospital nearest the World Trade Center, as of 2 p.m. Eastern Time today, they had 184 people who had come through. 2 were dead. That hospital is now full, and they're taking injured people to other hospitals. Bellevue, a large hospital in Lower Manhattan, or not in Lower Manhattan, but downtown anyway, is a little farther away. They, at 3 p.m., had 120 minor injuries, 20 major injuries. 2 people arrived dead on arrival, and 2 people went straight into an operating room. Most hospitals are saying 10 to 20% of the cases they're seeing are in critical condition, and right now it does look like hundreds of people in New York area hospitals. Meanwhile, Brooklyn and Queens hospitals are reportedly moving their non-critical patients out to the Long Island suburbs in order to make room for more people coming in from Manhattan.
And what kind of injuries are showing up there?
Lots of smoke and dust inhalation. That cloud that has hung over New York City all day long has been just pernicious. New York University Hospital has been handing out dust masks. I spoke to a friend this afternoon who said that in Brooklyn Heights it looked like it was snowing this afternoon. The dust was coming down so heavily. Cuts and scrapes. A woman told the Brooklyn Hospital that she was in her high-rise office building when the window shattered. Something lacerated her leg. She turned and looked and said it was an aircraft gauge. Lots of broken bones, and some of the more severe cases have been burns, crushing, and other severe bodily trauma.
And for sure, a serious need for blood in New York?
Absolutely. The hospitals are saying right now they need blood. They in particular need type O blood, which is the so-called universal donor. Hospitals all over New York City have lots of people waiting in line to give blood. Bellevue Hospital told me about an hour ago that they had people packing their waiting room waiting to give blood. They're asking people to go to hospitals in the outer boroughs or uptown in Manhattan because the lower Manhattan hospitals are just swamped with casualties right now.
And what is it like to be outside, to be on the other side of Manhattan Island?
Everybody is just numb in Brooklyn. There were people lining the Brooklyn waterfront today, just sitting there numbly staring across the East River, trying to make sense of this. And the human tragedy is just so incomprehensible right now that most people were just remarking on the fact that those two beacons, those two symbols of New York, were just gone. They weren't there anymore. And that in itself is hard enough to get your head wrapped around.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Noah.
NPR's Rick Carr speaking with us from New York. Back now to our colleague Robert Siegel in New York, who was out today talking to people at Grand Central Station.
In Midtown Manhattan this morning, mobs of commuters who had barely arrived at work struggled to leave the city. They streamed en masse up and down the avenues, and as they looked downtown, they could see a huge cloud of dust, smoke, and debris in the sky, obscuring the skyscrapers of the financial district. The evidence of the collapse of the World Trade Center towers hung in the sky all day. At 42nd Street, people headed for Grand Central Terminal. At 10:50 this morning, they found the doors to the railroad station shut and blocked by transit police. Then, just before 11, the transit police got word by walkie-talkie that another entrance to the station just down the block was about to open. From every direction, people walked into the station. The empty hall of Grand Central filled up in no time, and by 11:05, thousands of commuters seeking an exit to the suburbs stood watching for news of a departure. Among them, Surendra Patel, an accountant, and Roseanne Rotunda, who works for Pfizer.
I'm trying to get to White Plains, which is not where I live. It's just where my husband works. I'm just trying to be anywhere but here.
Anywhere but Manhattan.
Right. Pretty much.
I'm trying to go to Scarsdale. And, terrible. I saw the second building collapsing myself. Terrible. Just terrible.
By 11:10, though, the police spread the latest orders.
No trains. Evacuate the building, please. I have no idea.
Attention, please evacuate Grand Central. Go to the nearest exit. Evacuate Grand Central Terminal now.
And with uncharacteristic discipline, no doubt born of fear, the crowd that had just filled the station left it empty once again. The subways were closed, Hudson River crossings were shut, the buses were packed. Those with cell phones used them, those without lined up at payphones. At 34th Street, there was suddenly word that the Queens Midtown Tunnel was open. A large air-conditioned bus, a Hampton Jitney it was called, pulled up to a curb, and when its front door opened, Police Officer Mike Platus addressed the crowd that was waiting outside.
Everybody gets off and Maurice Avenue. Officer, where's Maurice Avenue anyway?
Even if some of these people didn't know where Maurice Avenue was, that didn't seem to matter. It was someplace closer to home, and it was someplace safer.
Here is a review of today's story. 4 commercial airliners crashed this morning, 2 into the World Trade Center towers in New York, 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 on the ground near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The crashes were the biggest terrorist attack ever.
In Washington, the White House and the Capitol building were evacuated. Injured from the Pentagon were taken to local hospitals. President Bush ordered the nation's military to high alert status. The Federal Aviation Administration has grounded all domestic commercial flights until noon tomorrow, if not longer.
There was chaos all day in New York City. Both of the World Trade Center towers collapsed into the street. Bridges and tunnels into Manhattan were closed. So were financial markets. Police estimated there would be thousands of people injured or killed, but no definite count until tomorrow. We'll be following the story throughout the rest of the day and tonight. You're listening to special coverage from NPR News.
This is special coverage from NPR News of today's terrorist attacks. I'm Robert Siegel in New York.
And in Washington, D.C., I'm Linda Wertheimer.
And I'm Noah Adams. Today, the worst act of terrorism anywhere, ever. Perhaps thousands were killed.
4 commercial jets were hijacked and crashed into civilian and military targets. 2 into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, 1 outside Pittsburgh.
President Bush ordered the nation's military to high alert status.
All flights in the U.S. were grounded.
All the financial markets were closed.
And many federal and state offices around the country were closed to protect against any other possible attacks.
We're going to New York now to hear from Andrea Bernstein, who is in Brooklyn, actually. Andrea?
Hi, how are you?
I'm fine. What is it like as people are trying, I suppose, at this time of evening to get out of Manhattan?
Well, I am standing at the foot of the Manhattan Bridge in Brooklyn, and there are thousands of people streaming off the bridge. It looks like the New York Marathon, although, of course, Women are dressed in high heels. Men are dressed in business attires. People have told me that they've come from Upper Manhattan, about a 5 to 6 mile walk to get here, and many have many more miles to go.
Would walking be their only choice?
Walking appears to be the only choice to get out of Manhattan and into Brooklyn. Once they're in Brooklyn, there is bus and train service out towards outer Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island. But to get here, many of them were told you have to walk. I've seen women who are 9 months pregnant. I've seen families waiting with strollers for women who were coming over from the other side with their babies that they'd taken out of daycare in Manhattan. And a sea of people like I've never seen before. This street that I'm on, Flatbush Avenue, a major thoroughfare, is closed to all but emergency vehicles, and the thousands of people walking by.
Now, it has not been possible throughout this day to go over into Manhattan from Brooklyn.
No, it's been blocked off for much of the day by any means. This is definitely the afternoon commute. I've been watching people all day coming over into Brooklyn. The earlier people were people who were very near the blast, and many of them told me that some of them were outside. They said it was complete and utter darkness. The sky blacked out, and all they could see was a glimmer of light from the East River, so they walked towards it.
The first plane hit the first tower this morning at 8:45. What can you see in the sky now over Manhattan from Brooklyn?
Well, it is a gorgeous, sunny September day here in New York, and there is a huge plume of brownish-gray smoke coming from Manhattan that has completely blotted out the sun. Every now and then you get an eerie view of the sun looking sort of orangey-red behind the smoke, but there is no more sunshine in this part of Brooklyn behind the plume of smoke.
And any sort of smell coming across the river there?
The smell has mitigated quite a lot. It was much worse earlier in the day, and people were holding handkerchiefs to their mouth here in Brooklyn, which is about probably a mile or two from the blast. They were wearing masks of the type that construction workers use. They had wet towels around their mouth, and it was really very hard to breathe. It smelled very, very smoky. Now it seems like most of that lower-level smoke has cleared off, and it's now high in the sky.
Smoke and dust. The people coming across the bridge seem to be survivors to you. They have that sort of sense about them.
Usually New Yorkers are quite happy to talk to a reporter. The people here are extremely fatigued. The first wave of people over the bridge were people that were shocked. They were in tears. They couldn't find words to talk about what had happened to them. This group of people is just tired. Many of them have been walking for hours in clothing that is totally inappropriate for a walk of that length. And they're exhausted, and they shake their heads when I ask them where they've come from. Many, as I say, come from Upper Manhattan.
Yes. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.
Andrea Bernstein talking with us from Brooklyn.
NPR's national security correspondent Tom Gelton was at the Pentagon this morning when the aircraft hit the building. He was evacuated with everyone else and reports now on how people reacted.
The Pentagon is a massive building, about 2 miles in perimeter. I entered the building about 10 minutes before the plane struck it. I entered on the east side, directly opposite the site of the crash, and I did not hear or feel the explosion. But Army Lieutenant Colonel Kenny Cox, watching television at the time, was near where the plane hit.
We said, I don't think this is happening, and boom, it happened. So I left out, I came back. We got a crew of 5, Air Force, Navy, Marines. We went in. But we couldn't get into them. It was too hot.
The 20,000 or more military and civilian personnel who work at the Pentagon were evacuated quickly, but the attack clearly caused many, many casualties. The Pentagon is built with a series of 5 concentric rings. The impact of the plane took a huge chunk out of the building, about 75 feet wide. The plane penetrated at least the first 2 rings, and that section of the building completely collapsed. Rescue forces were quick to arrive, but Rear Admiral Craig Quigley, the Pentagon spokesman, speaking late this afternoon, said the crews were unable to do much at first.
The fire was intense, and only recently have Arlington Search and Rescue people just recently been able to get inside the Pentagon. Fires are still burning very strongly inside the Pentagon, and we know there's a large number of injured, but I have no sense of scale at all.
Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and other senior Pentagon staff have their offices on the opposite side of the building from where the plane hit, but Admiral Quigley says Rumsfeld reacted quickly.
Secretary Rumsfeld was in his office when the aircraft hit the Pentagon. He went running down to the site where the aircraft hit, was helpful in loading some of the injured onto some stretchers, and then back up into the National Military Command Center. There he has been ever since and will remain for the indefinite future.
The National Military Command Center is the nerve center of the Pentagon. It's staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and maintains constant touch with U.S. forces around the world. Admiral Quigley says the command center was getting smoky late today, but that operations are continuing there. Elaborate precautions have been made at the Pentagon to protect the building from a terrorist attack on the ground, with a car or a truck bomb, for example. But for all the contingency planning that's been done at the Pentagon over the years, Quigley says this attack was different from what had been anticipated.
We have a variety of security plans to face a variety of conditions, but I think what you've seen here is a full assault on the United States of America.
And that's not something you can prepare for?
Well, I think we were able to evacuate the building very, very quickly. But as far as having some sort of a preparation to defend against an airplane coming in, that's just not something that you see in place.
For the moment, senior officials at the Pentagon are attempting to account for their own colleagues, and they've been unable to look far beyond. A full assault on the United States of America can hardly go unpunished, they say, but how the United States might respond to this attack is not something anyone is yet prepared to contemplate. Tom Gelton, NPR News, Washington.
We're joined now by NPR diplomatic correspondent Mike Schuster. Mike, the World Trade Center has been a target before. Why don't you remind us of when it was bombed and who was responsible?
The World Trade Center was bombed, Robert, in 1993. That bomb at that time killed 6 and injured hundreds. 4 Islamic fundamentalists were later soon arrested for that bombing. And eventually, when the investigation was completed and they went on trial, it was determined that they were actually trying to topple the World Trade Center, exactly as it occurred today. They were convicted in 1994, but the mastermind of their effort to bring down the World Trade Center was a man named Ramzi Youssef, who was out of the country at the time. He was eventually seized by U.S. intelligence agents and the FBI in Pakistan and brought to the United States and put on trial in 1997. And he and a couple of others were also convicted for masterminding the World Trade Center bombing. It's interesting to note that in 1993, Ramzi Youssef also plotted to blow up 5 airliners in the Far East, but that plot was never consummated. Ramzi Youssef, it's not clear who he was, where he's from. We still don't know who he was representing, if anyone. The one other connection to the World Trade Center bombing was that an Egyptian cleric, Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, was linked to the plot to the World Trade Center bombing in 1993, but put on trial and convicted for conspiracy to blow up other landmarks in New York in 1993, including the Holland Tunnel, the Lincoln Tunnel, the United Nations, and a big federal building.
But in terms of sophistication, today's events involved hijacked airliners, and we can only imagine hijackers who then knew how to fly the aircraft. This is very different from vans packed with explosives.
Certainly it is, but it resembles different terrorist incidents and plots at different times. As I said, Ramzi Youssef tried to bomb 5 airliners in the Far East. That never happened. Later on in 1998, there were coordinated attacks on 2 U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and in Tanzania. And at that point, experts begin to see the element of coordination entering into terrorist plots. There was the Millennium Plot at the end of 1999 that was uncovered. The ultimate target there was Los Angeles airport and an attack on American tourists in Jordan and a possible attack on a U.S. naval ship in Yemen. So the element of coordination has emerged in the late 1990s.
And just briefly, in the time that remains, followers of Ramzi Youssef would presumably be suspected here. Who else?
followers of Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman, certainly Osama bin Laden, because of this element of coordination, which he was linked to the Africa bombings and to this Algerian effort that has recently emerged. And there's one other possible suspect, and that's Saddam Hussein. Ramzi Youssef came into the United States with an Iraqi passport, and there were some experts who always believed that Saddam Hussein was behind the first attack on the World Trade Center.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Robert.
NPR diplomatic correspondent Mike Schuster.
Throughout the nation today, virtually every federal agency and many state government agencies heightened security. Schools closed, workers went home. NPR's Brian Naylor joins us now. Brian, starting with Washington, what is the latest thing happening here?
Well, the latest, the Capitol building was shut down. The legislative leaders, congressional leaders, were sent off to an undisclosed secure location. But officials say they want to reopen the Capitol building as soon as possible. That could come as soon as tomorrow, in order to emphasize that that it will be back to business as usual. And the Capitol being such a symbol of freedom and of the nation, they want it open again.
And around the country?
Around the country, state capitals closed in places like Florida and West Virginia and Oklahoma City. All state office buildings were closed, and they established a perimeter around the jail where Oklahoma City bombing conspirator Terry Nichols is housed. What's more, the Customs Service said its border crossings were at a threat level 1, which is the highest state of alert. They say the borders remained open, but that traffic crossing into the U.S. was subject to the highest level of scrutiny. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission said it was recommending operators of the nation's nuclear power plants to go to their highest level of security, not because of any specific threats, but because of a precaution.
The private sector, needless to say, it has not been business as usual in this country.
There were closures in virtually every American city of large office buildings, the Sears Tower in Chicago, office buildings in Los Angeles. Disneyland and Disney World were closed, and it was certainly not business as usual.
Thanks very much, Brian. You're listening to special coverage from NPR News. This is special coverage from NPR News on today's terrorist attacks. I'm Linda Wertheimer.
And I'm Noah Adams. Here's a review of today's story. The biggest act of terrorism ever was carried out this morning when 4 hijacked commercial flights were crashed, 2 into the World Trade Center towers in New York, 1 into the headquarters of the U.S. military, and 1 on the ground outside of Pittsburgh. Government offices around the country were closed. The U.S. military forces around the world were put on the highest alert status.
NPR's Don Gagne is here with us in the studio. Don, earlier you were with the president in Florida, and the president has left there. Where has he gone?
The president first left Florida and went to, the first time we saw him make any kind of an extended statement on this, he was at an air base in Louisiana. We were then told he was going to another undisclosed location, and just in the last hour or so, we found out that he's outside Omaha at another air base, Offutt Air Base, the headquarters of the Strategic Air Command, and he is there until late this evening, when we're told he is coming back to the White House.
Well, now, the president and the leaders of Congress were removed to so-called secure locations, I suppose, in the event that they had to conduct government business in some safer place than Washington.
Right, right.
Do we assume that the fact that they're bringing him back to Washington means that people feel that it's all right to be here now?
That's hard to say. They may not have felt comfortable bringing him back here right away when this was unfolding so rapidly today. But I think they may also feel the need to have him back in Washington and to get ready to make some sort of a statement to the American people, though we don't know when that could happen. Vice President Cheney and Condoleezza Rice, his national security advisor, have been at the White House, 2 of the few people in the White House since this morning, and he has been in contact with them. But again, he will be joining them at the White House tonight.
And we are expecting perhaps a statement from the president. We've just seen sort of fragmentary remarks from him so far, but some sort of major statement?
We will hear something from him, but we can't say at this point when it will be. And it could be late this evening before he actually gets back. So I think while everybody is waiting to hear something from him, we don't know when yet.
Thanks very much, Don.
Thank you.
NPR's White House correspondent Don Gagne.
Americans historically have felt insulated from acts of terrorism such as we experience today. The attacks on the World Trade Center building in New York and the Pentagon in Washington are distinguishable not only for their size but also for the apparent planning and resources that made them possible. Alan Brinkley is a professor of history at Columbia University in New York. He says today's events will force the country to view its relationship with the rest of the world differently, even as we make efforts to find those responsible for the attacks.
I think what makes this so extraordinary is the enormous scale of what happened today, and the obvious massive conspiracy that was behind it, the large-scale coordination. I mean, so many things happened that are so difficult to do today that it really does make one feel that there's a much larger force at work in this event than was at work in the Oklahoma City bombing or the first World Trade Center bombing or any of the other sort of scattered terrorist events we've had in the United States.
You have to ask yourself if somebody was able actually to more or less successfully hijack 4 aircraft, commercial airliners, today in the morning, why couldn't they have done it 2 months ago?
Clearly they have found some way around the security mechanisms we've developed. The airports from which these planes were hijacked are not low-security airports. So, I mean, I think that's what is going to take some time to sink in our national psyche is the magnitude of this event and the total secrecy within which it had been shrouded.
There have been comparisons made and will continue to be made with Pearl Harbor almost 60 years ago. 2,000 people died, and America begins an involvement in a world war. Is it a fair comparison today?
Well, it's a fair comparison and an unfair comparison. I mean, this is not an act of war in any conventional sense. I don't think anybody imagines that there will be an invasion of the United States or that large-scale military activity will, at least immediately, follow this. One of the central characteristics of our culture throughout our history has been our sense of being protected by the two oceans, that we're somehow separated from the rest of the world and safer, in a way, than the rest of the world. But I think what this does is demonstrate the falsity of that assumption. We are not protected from the rest of the world. We're part of the world, and that a terrorist event of this scale, which has never happened in any part of the world, to my knowledge, nothing of this magnitude has happened in any other nation, has happened here. It's going to be a very hard thing, I think, for Americans to assimilate.
Professor Brinkley, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Alan Brinkley is a professor of American history at Columbia University in New York. Earlier today, we spoke with John Axisa, who was on his way to work when the first plane hit the World Trade Center.
It was such a surreal thing. I think I commented out loud to the people around me, it looked like the end of the world. And each time I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. The next thing I saw were people jumping from the building. And I will never see anything so horrible in my life. These people just choosing their way of death as opposed to succumbing to flames and smoke, I guess.
What kind of view did you have of them, and how did you know for sure they were jumping?
I was across the street. These were people, I could see their clothes. I saw a gentleman in a red shirt, and his arms weren't waving or nothing. He just calmly jumped, and 7 in all, I believe. I didn't see them all. I turned my head in horror, but each time someone else would jump, the whole crowd would break into hysterics. And then the second building went up. I heard no aircraft. I was right across the street. I was still refusing to believe it was an aircraft at that point, but the explosion was deafening. I felt the impact on the back of my head as I turned to run, and I literally thought my shirt caught fire from the heat. It felt like the flames touched me. I know they didn't. I know how ridiculous that is, but it was just that hot. It was that insane. The wind, the debris, people were falling to the ground, and I wanted to stop and help them, but self-preservation told me just keep going. The building was going to fall, which eventually it did do, but by that point I was 4 or 5 blocks away.
Mr. Axisa, thank you for talking with us.
Sure.
Good luck to you, sir.
Thank you.
John Axisa speaking with us from New York earlier today.
Here's a review of today's story about the biggest terrorist attack ever. Both World Trade Center towers collapsed this morning after 2 hijacked commercial airliners crashed into the skyscrapers. Fire sparked by the collapse continued to burn. The U.S. military headquarters was also attacked. One side of the Pentagon collapsed under another commercial jetliner. A fourth plane crashed on the ground 80 miles outside Pittsburgh. The Federal Aviation Administration has stopped all domestic commercial flights until at least noon tomorrow. Financial markets were closed today and will be closed tomorrow as well. We're following this story throughout the rest of the day and tonight. You're listening to special coverage from NPR News.
This is special coverage from NPR News of today's terrorist attacks in New York City and Washington. In Washington, I'm Noah Adams.
I'm Linda Wertheimer.
And in New York, I'm Robert Siegel. Chaos was unleashed today in New York and Washington as the United States was hit by the worst terrorist act in history. 4 commercial jets were hijacked and crashed into civilian and military targets. 2 into the towers of the World Trade Center in Manhattan, 1 into the Pentagon, and 1 plane crashed outside Pittsburgh. Hundreds of people were aboard those planes that crashed, and the death toll could be in the thousands. Earlier this afternoon, New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani had this to say to the residents of his city.
Everybody should, in their own way, say a prayer and ask God for help and for assistance, and also ask God to give us the strength to overcome this, because I know we're going to need strength to overcome it. And I want the people of New York to be an example to the rest of the country and the rest of the world that terrorism can't stop us. American democracy is much stronger than vicious, cowardly terrorists, and we're going to overcome this.
You were listening to New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani. We're joined now by Marianne McCune, who is a reporter with WNYC in New York City. Right now she is at the major triage center just north of the World Trade Center. A triage center has been set up to handle people being brought out of the building who are then, I assume, sent on to other hospitals. Marianne, you spent the day downtown at the bombing site. Can you tell us what is going on now at the triage center?
Now it's really just people are poised to receive patients, but the action is more preparation than anything else. They moved to they had a triage center set up further south earlier, but because 7 World Trade Center is considered still very dangerous and it's still burning, they moved it up here. Now this is being called Ground Zero. They have a team of ambulances, a team of triage nurses, an area set up for non-critical trauma, psychiatrists, counselors, and clergy. But again, everybody is poised for action. There aren't a lot of patients coming in now. The mayor said earlier that more than 1,000 rescue workers are out there working to get people out, and there are also teams of volunteers from all walks of life all over. But it's dangerous down there, and it's been difficult to get close enough to actually rescue people. We did just have a round of applause on this corner where there are quite a few people now, because a fire truck emerged covered with this thick gray debris that's been blowing everywhere down here. Go ahead.
When you look around you right now down in that part of Manhattan, we were told that it almost has blocked out the sun, the dust and the ash from the collapse of the 2 buildings.
Absolutely. The smoke has at certain times gotten so strong and high that it's blocked out the sun. The ground is covered with this sort of thick gray dust, and there are papers and pens and all kinds of things that you would imagine came from offices all over the ground. Earlier, I drove over with some triage nurses from a hospital, the hospital that's actually nearest to the World Trade Center, but where the action had died down since this morning. So these triage nurses were looking to go where they could make themselves more useful. But on the way over, it was, I mean, I hate to keep saying this, and I keep hearing people say this, but it looks like a war zone.
Have you talked to people who were in the building and came out of it?
Yes. Earlier in the day, actually, when the first 2 collapses were happening, I was at the place where people were running to get away from it. So each time there was an explosion or a collapse, there would be a wave of people fearing for their lives, and the first waves would be people who weren't that close, and then more and more people showed up who were covered with soot and describing things like, being on the 87th floor of the World Trade Center and running down 87 flights, getting out just before a collapse happened. People described seeing people jumping out of windows from very high up in the building. And then the dust and the debris after the collapses was so strong that you couldn't see anything. One person described thinking he was lost in a cloud of dust and then being saved by the flash of a photographer's camera.
Marianne, do you have any sense of whether most of the people who were in the building got out or not?
It's very, very difficult to know that at this time. I mean, even the mayor is hesitating to estimate. He said in his press conference that he guessed there were 10,000 people, he said this is a guess, so that there were 10,000 people in the building. And then he talked about, but many of those people may have been rescued. He said that 1,500 people were brought over to New Jersey, the New Jersey shore on ferries, so certainly that many were saved, and 600 people this was earlier in the day he was saying this, but the 600 were treated in local hospitals,
right.
150 removed by EMS, but now it's just very difficult to tell.
Thanks very much, Marianne.
Thank you.
Marianne McCune is a reporter with WNYC in New York City.
Our colleague Robert Siegel is also in New York. Robert, the difficult thing here, I guess, throughout this day is to avoid panic among the people there.
Yeah, I think what I saw today, and this was in Midtown Manhattan, so it wasn't immediately in the area of destruction. It wasn't panic. People were obviously very anxious. I didn't hear much gallows humor from anyone. This was not like a blackout where there's some element of fun to it, not at all. And on the other hand, although I guess we really won't know what truly happened all over New York City today for a while, I didn't get any sense of violence or looting or anything like that.
In the city, the mass transit, let's say people wanting to leave that city very quickly this morning, the subways were shut down, the bridges were closed. How could people do that?
Subways were shut down. Buses were still running. Service was not full, but bus would pass periodically, and they would be packed with people. The logistical feat of New Yorkers getting to work, of people coming from the outer boroughs, from the suburbs of the city, in and then out every day, is fairly miraculous without something like this happening. Then for New Yorkers to get to work, drop off children, collect them at the end of the school day, and put all that together is a rather difficult piece of urban logistics. If you can imagine how complicated this was as people tried to get back to their homes early in the morning without benefit of trains, simply headed walking in the right direction, tried to hitch rides with vans as they came. Then you'd learn that one tunnel or bridge was open, but only outbound. And lots of people improvised, lots of people walked enormous distances today.
I suppose, too, there was throughout this day sort of a desperate need for people to get in touch with spouses and with children throughout the city.
Yes, I mean, the difference between an event like this and anything even remotely similar that might have happened 10 years ago is the soundtrack of it is thousands of people in cell phone conversations talking with somebody, a loved one, or calling the office, or just trying to tell someone, I'm okay. I wasn't at the office yet this morning, so I'm all right. So that was going on constantly, and at every payphone you'd see a line of people waiting to get to the payphone, obviously to connect up with people at home or with the caregiver of the children to explain what to do with the kid if you were stranded in Manhattan.
New Yorkers have been tested before, of course, but never on this scale.
Nothing has ever happened like this, and the measure of the magnitude of it is that as you walk around Midtown Manhattan and you look south and you look downtown, you would think that there's a huge fire perhaps 10 blocks away, and then you realize, no, that cloud of smoke that's hanging over Manhattan is the cloud of debris and smoke and dust that's gone up from where the World Trade Center towers should be. It is vast, and it is oppressive.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Noah.
Our colleague Robert Siegel in New York.
NPR's Steve Inskeep has been around the city of Washington today, checking out reports of car bombs and other attacks. He spent most of his time at the Pentagon, where one of the hijacked planes crashed into the building shortly after 9:30 this morning. Steve, can you walk us through what happened in Washington today?
Well, Linda, I suppose the best place to witness the beginning of this day, and it's unfortunate to phrase it that way, was on top of a hill not too far from the Pentagon. I spoke to a gentleman who was here in Arlington this morning. He said he heard an enormous roar. He looked up just in time to see a plane flying very low overhead, flying so fast, he said, that he had no idea even what kind of a plane it was. And then that aircraft smashed into the Pentagon. We're looking right now, Linda, and I hope you can hear me as a helicopter passes over. We're looking right now at the result of that, an enormous gap in the Pentagon, in the wall. We're told that this plane crashed through the outer ring of offices, through a courtyard, through the next ring of offices, through another courtyard, and into the third ring, and flames burned intensely for quite some time. Just now does it look like they're beginning to get the fire almost under control, and the smoke is diminishing.
But with all that, apart from the area of the direct hit, people were evacuated from the Pentagon office building.
People were evacuated from the Pentagon office buildings, that's correct, and it's interesting that some people had different reactions, though. There were, we're told, and I've met a number of people today who actually went toward the fire, actually went toward the explosion and tried to find people, tried to help people, tried to bring them out. Pentagon officials have told us that at least one man who did this, who was outside the building, raced into the building, tried to bring people out, and was severely burned as a result. So there are quite a few stories of heroism here. Other people have simply tried to stay out of the way and kept a nervous eye on the sky. There have been false alarms and alerts all over Washington today, alarms about possible attacks on the State Department, on the Capitol, alarms about more airplanes in the sky, unidentified, and questions about where they were heading. On a couple of occasions here at the Pentagon, people went running away from the building at the urging of the police in order to stay clear in case another aircraft were to crash. But for the most part, people have stayed calm.
When I was out earlier today, I noticed that the only planes in the air were military aircraft. What is the military doing in this country and around the world?
Well, the military has put itself on what they call Force Protection Condition Delta. And what you need to know is that is the highest state of alert that they have. They've changed the alert system they used to have during the Cold War. And U.S. military forces around the world are on their highest state of alert and prepared, we presume, to act. Although, of course, the first question is, if you're going to strike back, what do you do? In the meantime, 2 American aircraft carriers have shoved off from Norfolk today. They've headed up the East Coast simply to be in position to assist in any way that they can, providing helicopters or other transport, hospital facilities, anything else, with the damage here in Washington and also up the coast in New York City.
Thanks very much, Steve Inskeep.
Happy to help.
NPR's Steve Inskeep will be back in a moment with more special coverage of today's attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. This is NPR. This is special coverage from NPR News on today's terrorist attacks. I'm Linda Wertheimer.
And I'm Noah Adams. In a time of national crisis, we are used to turning to the federal agencies in Washington for regular updates and news conferences. That has not happened today. The only federal official we've seen, except for brief remarks by the president, was his assistant Karen Hughes. She spoke this afternoon at the FBI to assure the country the president is working on the issue.
He is in continuous communication with the vice president and key members of his cabinet and national security team. Vice President Cheney and our national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, are in a secure facility at the White House. I have just come from there. The Secretary of Transportation and other members of our White House senior staff are gathered at a command center there, and we are coordinating with other branches of our federal government.
Bush aide Karen Hughes speaking earlier today. We're joined now by NPR's Barbara Bradley. Barbara, you've been at the FBI. What's going on in official Washington right now?
Well, as far as the FBI is concerned, we don't know a whole lot about what's going on. I've been standing outside of the FBI building since the first thing in the morning. The only official statement that they would give us is that, first, they have dispatched investigative teams to all the disaster sites. Second, that their first priority is to help the wounded. And finally, that they're working with other government agencies. So it's not been a whole lot of communication.
So when you don't have things being given to you by people in government, what do you do? How do you find out there? What's happening?
Well, you make phone calls when the cell phone is working, which today didn't work a whole lot. Today I spoke to a longtime FBI profiler, Clint Van Zandt, who's an expert on terrorism and specifically has been watching a major suspect, Osama bin Laden. And Van Zandt said that the U.S. did have some early warning signs. For example, someone from his organization wrote a British newspaper last week and threatened an attack on the U.S. And there was an earlier warning about 3 weeks ago. And at least Van Zandt said that he was not surprised about the timing since, as you know, one of bin Laden's top lieutenants was about to be sentenced tomorrow in New York City for his role in the bombings of the 2 U.S. embassies in Africa.
So with the warnings that apparently were out there, why could this attack not have been predicted?
We get dozens of warnings every week, sometimes every day, and it's really nearly impossible to know which ones are legitimate or not. Experts say it takes a long time to get the infrastructure for this kind of strike in place. I mean, you have to train the pilots, you have to do the logistics, the planning, you have to raise some money. But once that plan is set up, the strike can happen at any time, and they can just choose to wait until a significant date. And that may be what's happened this time.
Now, tell us, is anything known about any of the victims in any of the deaths at the Trade Center or the other airline crashes today?
I don't believe we don't know the specific number of victims yet. We don't even know that. We do know the identity of one victim. She was Barbara Olson, who's a very influential Republican activist and is also the wife of the Solicitor General, Theodore Olson. She was on the American Airlines plane that crashed into the Pentagon, and apparently she was able to call her husband and say that the plane was being hijacked and that all the passengers had been moved to the back of the plane. And then, of course, the plane crashed into the Pentagon. It's kind of a chilling scene to think of.
Thank you, Barbara. NPR's Barbara Bradley.
The federal government sent workers home mid-morning today, shortly after the American Airlines plane crashed into the Pentagon. Federal workers poured out of buildings in downtown Washington, creating a citywide traffic jam as they tried to make their way home, adding to difficulties for ambulances and fire trucks trying to reach the Potomac River bridges on the way to the destruction at the Pentagon. Patricia Rivera of Denver and Phil Gentry of Portland, Oregon were in the city for a meeting at the Small Business Administration. Their meeting was canceled for now, and they were walking toward the bridges.
First time in my life, I saw cops with guns, and I'm in the street, M16s, and I've never seen that.
You have to treat this almost as a war zone, and the safe thing is not to be where there's visible buildings that might be of interest to terrorists, and a subway would be one of those. So we're walking and trying to stay away from the main federal buildings.
Near the arena where Washington's basketball teams play, we ran into Erica Thornburg, who, along with some colleagues from the Veterans Administration, decided to go to lunch.
The streets are blocked, people aren't moving, the police are trying to direct traffic. Most of us don't have enough gas to get home if we're going to be sitting in traffic like this for 3 hours. So we might as well eat.
George Ray was walking away from the mall and the complex of federal office buildings hand in hand with his wife, Betty. He'd hiked over from his offices at Housing and Urban Development to find her.
I could see out my window the billowing smoke coming out of the Pentagon. This is terrible. There's panic in the streets. We'd never thought we would be attacked like this. Never, ever.
And I think the worst part of it is trying to get in touch with your loved one. But as you can see, the streets are just packed. No one's moving. Cars are standing in place for half an hour or hour more, just still at the same stoplights.
From the glittering white obelisk of the Washington Monument to the immense dome of the Capitol, the Washington Mall looked almost normal. But the people drifting along its paths were workers sent home. Smoke was rising over the Smithsonian Museum from the fire at the Pentagon, and the white buildings bathed in bright sunshine were completely empty, evacuated, including the Capitol building and the 6 big office buildings that house members of the House and Senate. There was a loose cordon of Capitol Police keeping people off the grounds. A few people across Constitution Avenue gathered in the deep shade of the park. We passed a parked car where a dozen people were gathered around a car radio, and we stopped for a moment to listen as a limousine driver gave directions to pedestrians trying to get home.
Andrews is shut down.
So the Green Line is running.
Green Line is open.
Oh, okay.
This is my job. I know the city. I've been paying attention to what's been going on the radio. And every bit of information that I get, I just pass on. This is total gridlock right here.
That was Jess Pipkin, who parked his limousine on the mall this morning and tried to help.
Here is a review of today's story about the biggest terrorist attack ever. Right now, medical centers in New York are treating people injured in this morning's attacks. 2 hijacked commercial jetliners crashed into both of the World Trade Center towers. The towers caught on fire and then collapsed into the street below. And this afternoon, another building at the World Trade Center complex has collapsed. Police estimate that thousands of people have been injured and killed in New York. The Pentagon was also attacked. We'll be following this story throughout the rest of the day and tonight. You're listening to special coverage from NPR News.
This is special coverage from NPR News. In Washington, I'm Linda Wertheimer.
I'm Noah Adams.
And I'm Robert Siegel in New York. Of the 4 planes that were hijacked today, 1 did not reach its target. United Airlines Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco crashed in Pennsylvania. There were 45 people on board when the jet slammed into a grassy field. NPR's Ken Barkis is just outside Shanksville, Pennsylvania, in the south-central part of the state. It's about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. And Ken, this is the flight from which there have been stories, at least, that passengers were making calls on their cell phones, describing what was happening in the flight. Is that correct?
That's what we hear. We've heard that there was one passenger for sure who was in a bathroom, apparently, who was calling 911 and saying that the plane was being hijacked. The 911 dispatcher listened as long as he could and then heard an explosion, and that was the last thing they heard. What's remarkable about the site, Robert, is how remote this is. On the way here, I've seen many Amish or Mennonite out in their field. This is really a very remote area. Where it actually crashed looks like it's a reclaimed strip mine. It's a large field, as you mentioned, about 80 miles east of Pittsburgh. And really, there are hundreds and hundreds of federal officials here. It's almost an alphabet soup of agencies, the ATF, FBI, NTSB. Most surprisingly, some of the first people here were actually postal inspectors. No one is being turned away who can help out here. There are even road crews from Pennsylvania that are helping at the site right now.
But helping at the site at this point, I assume, it doesn't mean that people hold out any hope of rescuing passengers or crew, do they?
Well, I think that's right. There are, this is a 3 to 5 mile area of a crime scene, a huge crime scene. One person who went actually into the woods where pieces of the plane seemed to be scattered came out and saying that there was no piece larger than a phone book, that he didn't see any bodies at all. He didn't see any pieces of the plane that were larger than a phone book. Someone else said they thought that an ATF official said the plane literally broke up into thousands of pieces.
Does it seem from what people described that the plane was still flying west, that is, as it would have been from Newark to San Francisco when it went down?
I think so. There was a guy I talked to who was running a bulldozer who said it came down he said if it had come down 50 feet sooner, he wouldn't be here right now. It came down very fast. The people around here, even in a town 2-3 miles away, felt the shaking and vibrations before they heard an explosion. I'm seeing them now bringing in cadaver-sniffing dogs. They're also bringing in dozens of these huge diesel-powered lights, assuming that they're going to be into the investigation well into the night here.
Thank you, Ken. NPR's Ken Barkis speaking to us from Shanksville, Pennsylvania. That's about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh.
One of the hijacked flights in the attack this morning was American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 flying from Boston to Los Angeles. The plane was carrying 81 passengers, 9 flight attendants, and 2 pilots. NPR's Mandalit Del Barco is in Los Angeles. Mandalit, what is going on there at the airport? Have they been treating this the way they generally treat a crash, summoning families to the airport?
Yes, as you know, the Los Angeles airport is closed. It was evacuated this morning, and officials from the airport and the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, are talking to reporters. We're expecting another briefing in a few minutes, but they said that they were working with the FBI and the Los Angeles police. People who, this morning at the airport, I went there before it was closed, and people who were waiting to get on flights were turned away and are now stranded. Some of the relatives of the passengers on those planes were whisked away to places where they hopefully were going to get some counseling, possibly to deal with. Although there's no definitive list of who the passengers were yet, the airlines have not released those complete list yet, but they are waiting to find out more about their relatives, and details are still a little sketchy. I know that I can tell you that in Los Angeles, a number of events have been canceled. They might seem a little bit minor right now, but the Latin Grammys, a big concert by Madonna, was canceled. The U.S.-Mexico border is on alert, and people are just stunned. Theme parks are closed. Disneyland is closed. Hollywood movie studios are shut down. Right now, people are just kind of anxious to find out more details because, as you know, a number of those those flights were on their way to Los Angeles. 3 of the flights that were involved today in the incidents were
on their way to L.A. Mandalit, with LAX closed today, as airports were across the country, any sense of when those airports will reopen very quickly?
Well, we might know in a few minutes. They're going to be giving another briefing today. But it looks like they're going to be closed indefinitely. I know that the state buildings, government buildings are closed, and the government just announced that they might open again tomorrow.
Thanks very much. NPR's Mandalit Del Barco reporting from Los Angeles.
NPR's Jackie Northam is in Chicago, where the Sears Tower was evacuated this morning and state government buildings were shut down. Jackie, what's been the response there in downtown Chicago?
Well, it's very, very quiet. It's almost eerily quiet in downtown Chicago right now. The lights are off and the doors are locked in most buildings in the Loop, including the major department stores. And as you said, the Sears Tower, other major buildings like the Hancock Center. The city officials began closing the buildings and evacuating them after it became clear that it wasn't just an isolated attack on the World Trade Center. The Pentagon had also been hit, and there was a fear that Chicago could also be a target. So they felt it was just better to play it safe and evacuate people.
What other precautions have been taken there?
Well, they've closed some schools. They've closed a lot of the shopping malls in the suburbs. They've closed all the federal buildings. Again, all the shops downtown. There's a real fear here because it's a major American city with several landmarks like the Sears Tower. And the fear is what's stopping this from the same kind of attack from happening here.
So there is apprehension, but the attacks took place in New York and Washington, not yet in Chicago. Still, people are concerned.
Yeah, they certainly are. The few people that I talked to who are remaining downtown today, that was their main fear. And the other one, of course, was disbelief at just the extent of this attack.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you.
NPR's Jackie Northam in Chicago.
In Florida today, reaction to today's terrorist attack included the closing of Walt Disney World and the suspension of the space shuttle operations. NPR's Philip Davis is in Miami. What are people in Florida saying today, Philip?
Well, as you know, the president was in Florida when the attacks occurred. He was attending an education event in the Sarasota area. He was reading to school children at the time, and that's when he made his first remarks about the statement of regret and that the U.S. would try to hunt down the perpetrators of this incident before he left. Meanwhile, the rest of Florida is just in a state of shock and an elevated state of alert. The U.S. Armed Forces Southern Command headquarters is here in Miami, and a spokesman told me that the facility is heightening its security measures and is restricting entrance into the facility and has posted more guards and has taken other precautions that he preferred not to talk about. Meanwhile, in the civilian government, the president's brother, Governor Jeb Bush, declared a state of emergency in Florida. Bush says it's just mainly a preemptive action, but he ordered the State House evacuated anyway, and state flags are flying at half-mast. But the governor says he expects the state government to be open for business tomorrow.
Right.
As you mentioned...
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
NPR's Philip Davis reporting from Miami.
Mark Zadeklik of Minnesota Public Radio is in Minneapolis, where he joins us now. The airport there is closed, as is the Mall of America in suburban Bloomington. What's been the response there in the Twin Cities, Mark?
No, very much like it's been in other parts of the country. People are saddened, they're shocked, they're uneasy about what's going to happen next. As you note, some of the landmark buildings in this area are closed. We have a World Trade Center building in downtown St. Paul that was evacuated. And the tallest building in Minnesota, the IDS building in downtown Minneapolis, was also evacuated. Many of the workers were not forced out of their offices, left on their own accord to go home so they could be with their families. Most public schools in Minnesota remained open during the day. Many of them had heightened security. Some after-school activities and events were canceled. It's a big story here. Obviously, New York and Washington, D.C. don't seem very far away to people here today.
And any word on when these buildings might reopen?
No, we don't know exactly what's happening here. The news keeps changing in terms of what's going to be open, what's going to be closed, when the airport's going to open, this sort of thing. The governor has activated a state emergency center. We have a special hotline established for people to report any specific, suspicious activity. The National Guard's on heightened alert in Minnesota, and security at state buildings has been increased. A lot of different precautionary measures in place. The officials here are urging the citizenry to be calm, and one gets a sense that a lot of the actions they're taking are intended simply to reassure a very shaken public that there will be order.
Thank you, Mark.
Yep.
Mark Zadeklik of Minnesota Public Radio speaking with us from Minneapolis.
Shortly after this morning's attacks, an Arab satellite television station reported that a radical Palestinian group, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, had claimed responsibility for them, but DFLP spokesman quickly denied any involvement, as did the leader of the Islamist group, Hamas. Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat condemned the bombings as shocking and unbelievable, and he offered condolences. But as NPR's Jennifer Ludden reports from Jerusalem, many Palestinians celebrated today's tragedies.
From Palestinian refugee camps in southern Lebanon to several cities of the West Bank, spontaneous rallies erupted as the extent of the attacks became known. Some 3,000 people marched in Nablus, clapping hands and waving Palestinian flags as gunmen fired into the air. In East Jerusalem, outside the walls of the Old City, a couple dozen celebrants handed out sweets to passers-by, a ritual gesture of festivity. A few drivers honked their horns in approval and flashed V for victory signs. Israeli police quickly dispersed the gathering, but shopkeepers lining the route were happy to explain their reaction. Money changer Nasser Cord, like many, felt certain the attacks were committed to further the cause of the Palestinians and to protest the U.S.'s unconditional support of Israel.
They accept whatever Israel does. So maybe they will think back now. They will think again. It's not good to be, you have to be straight with everybody. We are children, we are people, we want to live. Why should you support Israel regarding if it is right or wrong? They support Israel.
Over and over, Palestinians here denounced President Bush's unwillingness to intervene in the year-long Arab-Israeli conflict and his tacit support of Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. Another money changer who wouldn't give his name blamed Bush for Sharon's escalating use of force in the occupied territories.
He gave Sharon the green light to kill everybody. He don't care. He don't care for anybody.
I don't support these attacks on innocent human beings, he said, but let Americans now feel our suffering. Nasser Cord said Bush has a policy of war. This is what Bush wanted. This is what he gets. Israelis reacted to the attacks with shock and tightened security. Authorities announced that Tel Aviv's international airport would be closed to foreign airliners for at least 24 hours. Israeli diplomatic staff in the U.S. and several other locations were also stripped down to essential employees. One foreign ministry official said, "No one really understands this, who's behind it or what their aim is. We're waiting for it to become more clear." Jennifer Ludden, NPR News, Jerusalem.
We'll be back in a moment with more coverage of today's attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. This is NPR.
This is a special report from NPR News on today's terrorist acts. I'm Robert Siegel in New York.
And in Washington, I'm Linda Wertheimer. Today's attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were remarkably well coordinated. John Parakini runs the Washington office of the Monterey Institute of International Studies. Mr. Parakini,
guys, no advance.
Mr. Parakini, you've studied terrorist motivations and behavioral patterns. Does what we have seen today fit into some kind of pattern?
It fits to a certain degree. What we see today is unprecedented in many ways. But based on other attacks, mass casualty attacks, that seem incomprehensible by most of us, there is the pattern, if indeed the perpetrators are who we seem to believe they are, that is, people affiliated with Osama bin Laden, if those are the perpetrators, or somebody affiliated with the previous World Trade Center bombers, they have articulated their motivations as being revenge, retribution, wanting to demonstrate to Americans that there's a penalty for supporting Israel, and a range of psychological motivations, such as affirming that they are superior and that they hold the lives of thousands of people in their hands.
You wrote a report on the last attempt on the World Trade Center, the attempt to bomb the World Trade Center. Why is that a choice? Why is that such a potent symbol for people to attack?
It's an excellent question, because today it seems as though the symbol of our financial power, the World Trade Center, and the symbol of our military power, the Pentagon, were the targets of attack. But in 1993, I think it was more complicated. Certainly the World Trade Towers are an important symbol. But they also were directly in the line of sight across from the storage shed where the World Trade Center bombers were building their bomb. So they saw them every day. And moreover, one of the perpetrators of the World Trade Center bombing in 93 worked in a car company whose business was right opposite the World Trade Center. So many of his hires, people that he picked up, he got them right there at the World Trade Center. Finally, an important part is that at that time, the World Trade Center was one of the few buildings in the area with an underground garage.
But you're describing sort of informal reasons why people would choose the word, because convenience would be one of the reasons to choose it. These attacks today seem extraordinary. They seem sophisticated, involving people who are capable of piloting airliners, something that completely seems to have escaped the notice of those people who are trying to prevent these kinds of attacks and jump in before they happen. I think most Americans are just stunned by the possibility that such a thing could happen at all.
No question. This is off scale and unprecedented. There was a report, a White House Commission on Aviation Security and Safety in 1997, which followed the downing or the crash of TWA 800. Question in my mind today is, what measures have we implemented from that report? What did that report look at that might have prevented what happened today? It's been quite some time since we've had a hijacking in this country. So there clearly, this is breaking new ground. But there are events that require or that should be looked at in the past. There is the concern that the Air Egypt crash off of the East Coast may have been a suicide crash. There was a case in 1994 where some people from the armed Islamic group of Algeria hijacked a plane and had it fly over Paris and threatened to have it crash, or had it fly towards Paris and threatened to have it crash.
So there have been some indications that something like this might have been in the cards. You, in your study of the World Trade Center, you indicated that it was built to withstand an airplane crashing into it.
Well, it was built to withstand a crash of a 707, which is a much smaller plane than those planes that are believed to have crashed into it today. Of course, that could never be tested. Today it was tested with a plane of a whole other size and magnitude, and the tragic results we see.
Mr. Parakini, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
John Parakini runs the Washington office of the Monterey Institute of International Studies.
After this morning's explosions at the World Trade Center, most buildings in Manhattan emptied out, and the people who work in them attempted the long trek home. But the reverse was true for Manhattan hospitals, like Bellevue, just a few miles uptown from the blasts and the city's main trauma center. Nurses and doctors, scheduled or not scheduled, arrived at the hospital to work. And by 11:30 this morning, a couple of dozen New Yorkers were lined up at the entrance to Bellevue. They wanted to volunteer.
I'm a minister. I wanted to know if there's anything that I can do. If anyone needs to be, if they need me to talk to them, or... You're a minister? Yes. Okay.
Medical students turned up. A dentist presented himself to offer whatever help he might be able to provide. But the main assistance Bellevue needed was blood.
O positive, O negative, A, B, front of line, please.
Inside the rotunda of the hospital, the volunteers filled out forms, waited for their names to be called, and then got in line for their blood to be taken. Among them, James Stevenson and George Schneff, two men both of whom had been downtown in the financial district when the blasts occurred.
So I was working on 25th Street on Blue College. I'm a construction worker, and I saw the explosion. We went up to the roof and saw... I came here because I'm a registered nurse, but I came here to volunteer. And they, right now they're not calling for volunteers, so I figured I'd give blood.
So you're giving blood?
Right.
I was down there when I saw that both planes hit. I was on Fulton Street by the Millennium Hotel. I was on my way into number 6. Another few minutes and I would have been in the debris. We all ran into the hotel garage. Then we stood outside in shock. And then I saw the bodies coming out of the building. I said, this is horrible. And then the second one hit. I came up here and I heard the appeal for blood. It's a horrible thing down there. I mean,
saw the bodies falling out of the
building. There were people who on the 90th floor, it was either burned to death or jump out of the building. They were jumping out of the building. Must have seen about 20 of them. It was people on the ground were in shock.
Both cars show positive.
At 12:15 outside Manhattan's Bellevue Hospital, there is a line of hundreds of New Yorkers filling out forms so that they can give blood inside. Just a half an hour ago, there were barely a dozen people here, and now the line stretches out through the grounds of Bellevue out to First Avenue.
Here is a review of the story we're reporting today. The headquarters of the U.S. military came under direct terrorist attack this morning. A commercial jetliner was hijacked and crashed into the side of the Pentagon. American forces around the globe were put on highest alert. The White House and the Capitol building were evacuated. Also attacked this morning, the World Trade Center in New York City. Both skyscrapers, 110 stories tall, burned and then collapsed onto the street below after 2 jets smashed into the towers. A third building in the complex collapsed later this afternoon. Police are estimating that thousands of people were hurt or killed in New York alone. A 4th plane was hijacked this morning. It crashed in a field 80 miles outside of Pittsburgh. Before it went down, a passenger in that plane called 911 from his cell phone to try to get help. We'll be following this story throughout the rest of the day and tonight. You're listening to special coverage from NPR News.
This is special coverage from NPR News of today's terrorist attacks. I'm Robert Siegel in New York.
And in Washington, D.C., I'm Linda Wertheimer.
And I'm Noah Adams.
Center, we heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows.
There is a major fire at the Pentagon. Of the full 6-story height of the Pentagon is gone. The notch is about...
The building is falling right now. People are running through the street. Smoke is everywhere.
The United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Today, September 11th, 2001, the United States became the target of the worst terrorist attack in history.
These were parallel attacks on the most potent symbols of American financial and military power. At 8:45 this morning, an American Airlines plane hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York. About 20 minutes later, a second plane flew straight into the South Tower. Less than an hour after that, both buildings had fallen.
About an hour after the first strike in New York, a plane crashed into the Pentagon, collapsing one side of the building. Another plane crashed into a field near Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. The White House was evacuated. The president, who was in Florida, was rushed to a secure location.
Hundreds of people were aboard the 4 planes that crashed. No one knows exactly how many people were in the World Trade Center when it was destroyed. The death toll could be in the thousands.
At 8:45 this morning, New Yorkers were arriving at work, picking up a bagel or a cup of coffee on the way when today's first wave of calamitous news was announced. Newscasters reached for precedent. 60 years ago, a plane had crashed into the Empire State Building. People watched on television and also through the windows of their apartments and office buildings that faced downtown, and they saw the event repeat itself at the second tower. It became clear that there was no precedent for what was happening today. It will no doubt be days before all the black boxes are retrieved and all the dead and injured are accounted for, and it will certainly be a lot longer than that before the people who were in downtown Manhattan this morning ever forget the experience. NPR's Melissa Block has been near the World Trade Center today, and she's here with me now. Melissa, of course, the target was symbolic in some respects, but just for the sheer density of people who would be in one spot. You couldn't find more people packed in a small area than around the World Trade Center.
Absolutely, both for those killed and for those who were able to witness what happened, people walking to work over the Brooklyn Bridge. I talked with a construction worker named Murray Goff, who was at a construction site just north of the Twin Towers, and he described he had flown in last night from West Virginia, where he lives. He was working on this site when he heard the first jet screaming low overhead the work site.
And we heard it go over, and we looked up, and then we heard the crash. Run out here and look and seen the plane where it went into the side. We're standing here, can't believe it. Whenever the second plane crashed through the smoke into the other one, well, as soon as I seen that plane hit, I said it's a terrorist attack. They better call red alert all for federal buildings. I mean, that's the only thing it could be, because it came in right above us and just banked and went into the building.
It came in right over your head?
Yeah, right over here, just right over like that, and just banked. You could see it was an American airline. I didn't see the American airline, but some of the workers looked up and seen the plane and it was an American Airlines.
And then police and emergency workers were rushed downtown.
That's right. So they're all drawn to the scene. These planes have gone into the buildings. They go in to try to evacuate personnel. And later I saw just dozens of police cars that were driving around covered with debris, their windows caved in from the explosion. These were still the operating vehicles that they were using. I spoke with a Lieutenant Thomas Inez, who's with the Port Authority Police. He responded to the scene. He was there trying to rescue people. He saw people jumping off the highest floors of the Twin Towers after the planes crashed, and then he was there when the buildings came down.
I guess the scariest part was being covered in dust and not being able to see, and breathing through my hat. It was pitch black.
And you were breathing through your police hat?
My hat, yes, because that's all I had with me.
The people who were jumping, did you see them fall?
Unfortunately, yes. It's not something I would like to talk about, and unfortunately it's not something I'll ever be able to forget about. At first you thought it was pieces of the building falling, until you realized that they had arms and legs. And at this point, I really wouldn't want to say anything more about it.
He was off to give blood, I gather, later in the day.
I don't know about him, but I did speak with the parent of a young child who was picking him up from school. You saw a lot of parents rushing to schools to pick up their children. Michael Ruddy stopped to talk to me. His wife worked in the Trade Center until a year ago. What did you tell your son?
Excuse me. I'm very emotional about this. I explained to him that something very terrible had happened, that the World Trade Center, which he knows very well, because he used to call it Mama's Building. I told him that it had been hit by an airplane and had now been destroyed, and it doesn't exist anymore. He's, I think, concerned because he sees how sad I am. He kind of sees the sadness in me, and I think he's a little concerned about that. I asked a policeman outside school, what can I do? I want to do something, I want to help, and he said, give blood. So I'm going to go over to maybe St. Vincent's and see if I could do anything.
And indeed, there were many people going to many hospitals in Manhattan offering to give blood. Melissa, you live here, you cover this city, you've seen all kinds of things in New York. How would you describe the way New Yorkers coped with this today?
I don't think, clearly no one's seen anything like it, and it was a mix of things. You did see a lot of people who were drawn down as spectators, people with cameras. There was the little moment of a Salvation Army team that was setting out trays of milk and cookies, but at the same time, horror on the faces of New Yorkers as they clustered around radios. Cars had their radios cranked. People just devastated by what had happened here today.
Thank you. NPR's Melissa Block.
Here in Washington, less than an hour after the second plane crashed into the World Trade Center, a third aircraft sliced into the Pentagon. Dozens of injured people were shipped to area hospitals. Many of the seats of power in the Capitol, the White House, the Capitol, the Treasury and State Departments, were evacuated. And 2 hours later, United Airlines confirmed a fourth plane crash near Pittsburgh with no reports of survivors among the 45 on board. NPR's Peter Kenyon joins us now. Let's go back to the morning crash at the Pentagon, Peter.
Well, law enforcement officials say it was American Airlines Flight 77 en route from Dulles Airport in Virginia to Los Angeles that suddenly veered off course and smashed into the Pentagon. It ripped open a hole in the side of 3 of the 5 rings that you can see above ground on the Pentagon. Military officials said the fire was intense, the heat was blistering. At least 40 victims reported in local hospitals, 7 in critical conditions at a burn facility. Hard to get to the site because of the smoke and the fire. One victim from the plane has already been identified now. Barbara Olson, the wife of U.S. Solicitor General Theodore Olson, was aboard that flight. Law enforcement officials told the Associated Press Mrs. Olson called her husband from the plane and described the hijacking, saying that the hijackers were using knife-like instruments. Theodore Olson also confirmed that his wife was on board, saying he wished it wasn't so.
Now, to be clear about this, we had two planes hijacked that crashed into the Twin Towers in New York, and this would have been a hijacked aircraft also.
That's right. This one took off from Dulles Airport outside of Washington en route to Los Angeles and just immediately veered off and hit the Pentagon. Especially shocking, this sort of attack on the Pentagon, the center of the military, and an attack really on the nation's capital. It really was, Noah, and the rapid evacuation and the confusion around the city today was very telling. Tourists were being yelled at by agitated Secret Service agents, and it's kind of recognizing that confusion and how bad that might seem. The House and Senate leaders quickly gathered to say we're going to reopen the Capitol as soon as possible. President Bush, who had been traveling in Louisiana and Nebraska, decided to come back to Washington, where he's expected to address the nation tonight. And the military remains on high alert status. Military vehicles have been seen on the streets of Washington, D.C. We're not expecting a lot of details from President Bush on how the government will respond to this attack, but clearly there are expectations of something significant. I might mention in Israel today, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon called it a turning point in the war against international terror. Let's add a bit here about the fourth hijacked plane of the day. It crashed outside Pittsburgh. Virginia Congressman James Moran, he's a Democrat whose district includes the Pentagon. He was briefed by military officials today, and after the briefing he said that he thought that target was Camp David. The crash actually occurred about 85 miles northwest of Camp David, but there were, as you mentioned, 45 people on board, no expected survivors, and that crashed in a remote field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Thank you, Peter. NPR's Peter Kenyon.
For the first time ever, all U.S. air traffic was shut down today. The planes involved in the 4 deadly crashes were hijacked from airports in Newark, Washington, and Boston. It's not yet clear how airport security in those cities was breached so dramatically, but the hijackings mean routine security procedures, from X-ray machines to employee background screening, will be scrutinized for vulnerabilities, and there may be limits to how much protection can be tightened. NPR's Emily Harris joins us now. Emily, first of all, do we know anything about how these teams managed to hijack the planes?
No real details yet, Linda. There's a lot of security measures in place at airports, but clearly the events today have proven that what we have now are breachable. The security measures go from everything to the questions you answer when you check in, to the cockpit door, which is supposed to be locked, to background checks of employees, metal detectors, all that sort of stuff. What's definitely going to happen here is a stepped up look at security measures. Although some people say, look, this isn't as much airport security as national security. Where was the intelligence that this was being planned?
How hard would it be to get, if it was in fact if knives were used to hijack these planes? How hard would that be to get knives into an airplane?
Well, you do have metal detectors, obviously, that you go through, but there have been situations where those have been tested and breached. There have been officials, other individuals, some cases of reporters, I understand, have tried to take weapons through airport security and have succeeded. So there's obviously problems there. One real issue is the people who stand there, the scanners they're called, have an incredibly high turnover rate. They turn over at a rate of 100% a year nationally. So there's a lot more issues going on than do the X-ray machines work, for example.
These, whoever took these planes controlled them over long distances and flew them into specific targets, appeared to be pilots.
Yeah, it's clear to most security experts I've talked to that the people who did these attacks, planned them, were flying the planes. These planes are commercially available widely. It wouldn't be hard necessarily to get your hands on one and learn how to do it. But you definitely have to do that, because with today's planes, you push the wrong button and you wouldn't actually hit the World Trade Center. You'd do something else.
Thanks very much, Emily.
Thank you.
NPR's Emily Harris. This is special coverage from NPR News on today's terrorist attacks. I'm Linda Wertheimer.
And I'm Noah Adams. To bring us up to date on the extent of the victims, we turn now to NPR's Rick Carr, who's in Brooklyn. Rick, can we put numbers here on the number of dead and injured in New York and also really in Washington, D.C. and in Pennsylvania?
Well, what we know so far, Noah, is that 4 aircraft went down, 2 American Airlines flights and 2 United Airlines flights. They were carrying a total of 266 people. There were 92 people on American Airlines Flight 11, which was the first to hit the World Trade Center. There were 65 on United Airlines Flight 75, which was the second to hit. There were 64 on American Airlines Flight 77, which struck the Pentagon, and there were 45 on United Airlines Flight 93, which crashed in Pennsylvania. At the Pentagon, 50 people went to D.C. area hospitals. 8 of those are in intensive care. 7 are in burn trauma units. In New York City, 1,500 people, the walking wounded, were transported almost immediately across the Hudson River to a New Jersey park. 600 or more are currently in New York City hospitals. Officials at New York hospitals are saying 10 to 20% of those who have come in are in critical condition, and there are more coming in. The New York Police Department told the Associated Press this afternoon that they think that 10,000 or more people may be dead in the wreckage of the World Trade Center, and New Jersey officials are reportedly clearing the same park that was used for the walking wounded earlier today to serve as a temporary morgue.
Just to go back over that, the NYPD is saying it could be 10,000 still in the wreckage there.
It could be 10,000. The estimates are that 40 to 50,000 people work in the World Trade Center buildings every day, and it's unclear as to how many had arrived for work and then how many got back out when the buildings finally collapsed.
Now, in New York City, how are the hospitals coping with this?
Some of the hospitals have already closed in Lower Manhattan. At least one, St. Vincent's Hospital, was already full. That's the trauma center that's nearest the World Trade Center. They had admitted nearly 200 people by the time, or had treated nearly 200 people by the time they closed. They had 2 deaths there. They're sending patients elsewhere now, if they're able to go elsewhere. Bellevue Hospital, a little bit farther away from there, another large trauma center, had more than 120 minor injuries, more than 20 major injuries, and so far 2 people were dead on arrival there. Most of the injuries that are coming in are cuts and scrapes. Some of them are quite severe lacerations, lots of broken bones. The most severe cases are severe burns, crushing, severe bodily trauma. Most of the cases, however, are smoke and dust inhalation. There's been a massive cloud of dust and smoke that's been coming out of the wreckage of the World Trade Centers all day long and affecting all of Lower Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn.
And what is it like? What's it been like today in Brooklyn to be there?
People are absolutely in shock. I mean, I know that sounds like a bit of a cliche, but people are walking around the neighborhood where I live, ashen-faced. They don't really know what to say. They're gathering in shop windows to watch televisions and try to keep up to date and reaching out to one another to sort of try to console one another, but it hasn't all really sunk in yet. I went down to the Brooklyn waterfront earlier today, and there were dozens of people sitting on the rocks near a ruined pier in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and they were, for the most part, silent. They just couldn't think of what to say. They were staring across the East River, which had very light traffic on it today. Normally there are lots of boats going up and down the East River, very little traffic, just sort of staring across the water on this beautiful day and watching this column of smoke move across. Just couldn't find the words. Nobody there could really find the words to explain what they were feeling. Some people, however, were extremely angry, calling for retribution, even though they weren't entirely sure who had done this.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Noah.
NPR's Rick Carr speaking with us from Brooklyn. Back now to our colleague Robert Siegel in New York, who was out today talking to people at Grand Central Terminal earlier.
In Midtown Manhattan this morning, mobs of commuters who had barely arrived at work struggled to leave the city. They streamed en masse up and down the avenues, and as they looked downtown, they could see a huge cloud of dust, smoke, and debris in the sky, obscuring the skyscrapers of the financial district. The evidence of the collapse of the World Trade Center towers hung in the sky all day. At 42nd Street, people headed for Grand Central Terminal. At 10:50 this morning, they found the doors to the railroad station shut and blocked by transit police. Then, just before 11, the transit police got word by walkie-talkie that another entrance to the station just down the block was about to open. From every direction, people walked into the station. The empty hall of Grand Central filled up in no time, and by 11:05, Thousands of commuters seeking an exit to the suburbs stood watching for news of a departure. Among them, Surendra Patel, an accountant, and Roseanne Rotunda, who works for Pfizer.
I'm trying to get to White Plains, which is not where I live. It's just where my husband works. Just trying to be anywhere but here.
Anywhere but Manhattan.
Right. Pretty much.
I'm trying to go to Scarsdale. And, terrible. I saw the second building collapsing myself. Terrible. Just terrible.
By 10 past 11, though, the police spread the latest orders.
No trains. Evacuate the building, please. I have no idea.
Attention, please evacuate Grand Central. Go to the nearest exit. You need to evacuate Grand Central Terminal now.
And with uncharacteristic discipline, no doubt born of fear, the crowd that had just filled the station left it empty once again. The subways were closed, Hudson River crossings were shut, the buses were packed. Those with cell phones used them, those without lined up at payphones. At 34th Street, there was suddenly word that the Queens Midtown Tunnel was open. A large air-conditioned bus, a Hampton Jitney it was called, pulled up to a curb, and when its front door opened, police officer Mike Platus addressed the crowd that was waiting outside.
Everybody gets off and Maurice Avenue. Officer, where's Maurice Avenue anyway?
Even if some of these people didn't know where Maurice Avenue was, that didn't seem to matter. It was someplace closer to home, and it was someplace safer.
Here is a review of today's terrorist attack. 4 commercial flights were hijacked this morning, 2 American Airlines planes and 2 United planes. 2 crashed into the World Trade Center towers. Less than an hour later, both of the burning towers fell to the street below. A third building, 47 stories tall, collapsed about 5:20 Eastern Time this afternoon. Also attacked the Pentagon. One side of the building collapsed after the plane plowed into it. The injured were taken to area hospitals. The White House and the Capitol were evacuated. A 4th plane went down in a field outside of Pittsburgh. We'll be following the story throughout the rest of the evening and tonight. You're listening to special coverage from NPR News.
From NPR News, this is special coverage of today's terrorist attacks. I'm Robert Siegel in New York.
And in Washington, D.C., I'm Linda Wertheimer.
And I'm Noah Adams. Today brought the worst act of terrorism anywhere ever, perhaps thousands killed.
4 commercial jets were hijacked and crashed into civilian and military targets, 2 into the World Trade Center, 1 into the Pentagon, 1 outside Pittsburgh.
President Bush will address the nation tonight in 2.5 hours' time.
In New York City tonight, people are still struggling to comprehend the day's events. Beth Ferdec from member station WNYC just came from a news conference with New York's Mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, and she joins us now. Beth, because of where City Hall is located, the mayor himself was an eyewitness to this disaster. What did he say about his experience?
Well, the mayor is a very hands-on type of mayor, and he went immediately to the World Trade Center when the first plane struck the first tower. And then, sometime before the second plane struck the next tower, he became stuck in one of the surrounding buildings. He was stuck there for quite some time and became an eyewitness to the collapse of one of the buildings. And some reporters ran into him on the street as he was fleeing with his entourage, trying to figure out where to go next. And he wound up at another location with the governor, an undisclosed location for security reasons, where he's been briefing reporters throughout the day.
In New York City now, the effort must be simply to get people out of the area and into hospitals if they need to, try to get the dead out of the building.
Yes, that's right. The mayor and the governor and the police commissioner refuse to speculate on how many people have died. They say that it's just too early to talk about that yet. There's no way to know, and it would be unfair. We'd just be guessing, they told us. But right now what they can tell us is about 2,000 people were taken by ferry across the river in Lower Manhattan to Liberty State Park in New Jersey for treatment. These were the walking wounded, so to speak. Another 600 people were taken to area hospitals. All of the hospitals have been put on mobilization. They're giving out phone numbers for people who want to volunteer as nurses or doctors to relieve the people who are treating the wounded right now. There's been a huge push for blood donations and an enormous response from the city. And the city is also gearing up tomorrow. Schools are going to be closed. Lower Manhattan, south of 14th Street, is all going to be closed. The stock market's going to be closed. The election's been called off. We were supposed to be voting today for mayor and other city officials. So the whole city is really dealing with a search and rescue operation right now. They've put off all investigations. The FBI's Assistant Director, Barry Mon, was here, and he said that the investigation of why this happened is or what happened exactly, is taking a back seat to the actual search and rescue, which has been hindered, I should add, by the collapse of more buildings. It's not just the two towers that went down. There's also another building in the World Trade Center complex that just collapsed, and some other surrounding buildings that were affected that are also collapsing. So it's a tremendous danger right now in Lower Manhattan. They're saying they can't even get in there to rescue the injured or the dying, so they can't do an investigation. They don't even know if there was a bomb that brought these buildings down. They're not talking about that right now. All they'll say is they know that they were hit by two planes.
Beth, where were you this morning?
Well, I was awoken by my news director and told to get down to Lower Manhattan as soon as I could. And my apartment is in Greenwich Village, and I face the World Trade Center. And when I walked outside, I saw two holes in the Twin Towers from the planes that had struck. I then ran down as soon as possible, and I tried to get to the scene and was pushed away by some police saying, "You can't get any closer, you can't get any closer." And all of a sudden, there was a boom like the sound of a subway, and one of the towers collapsed, and there was a whoosh of debris that was just heading east toward the East River, and thousands of people running and screaming as fast as they could up Lower Broadway. And it was like a scene out of a disaster movie. I just couldn't believe it. Everybody was screaming. There was panic everywhere, and people were coming out with soot all over their faces saying they had seen people jumping off of the Twin Towers. They had seen people fleeing the flames. It was an incredible scene.
Beth, thank you very much.
Thank you.
NPR's Beth Ferdec reporting from New York City.
NPR's John McChesney is at the scene of the other attack today, the Pentagon, across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. John, what's going on right there now?
Well, no, I'm standing about 25 yards in front of the Pentagon, about 50 yards down from where the aircraft hit the Pentagon. I'm surrounded by hundreds of firemen. They've been fighting this fire now for 9 hours. It's mostly extinguished. The roof is crawling with firemen now. They've got 3 hook and ladders up here, and they're trying to punch through the roof and put out the rest of the fire. And some very weary-looking guys who've been fighting this fire for a long time from all over the D.C. area. There are fire departments here from Arlington, from D.C., plus rescue squads. So far, I have not seen anybody taken out this side of the building. If there have been any injured taken out, they were taken toward the core of the Pentagon, toward the inside. But right now, to my left, the old guard, which is made up of all the military branches of service, the guys who do the ceremonies at Arlington Cemetery, and the guys who give tours of the Pentagon, are lined up for the very grim task soon of going inside and finding the dead and removing them. They're all wearing surgical masks. They all have litters and body bags.
Does it seem as if there are enough rescue crews on the scene at the Pentagon?
There are a lot of rescue crews here, and I've seen a number of the professional crews go in. It has been, I have to tell you, extremely chaotic here today. I came in here and actually was recruited to be on one of the litter crews. We were mobilized, I think, 4 times, lined up, given masks and rubber gloves, and each time we would line up, they decided they didn't want to send us in, which was probably very smart because this is a bunch of amateurs and not very well clothed for the effort. It's when you get this many different fire departments, many different rescue people, this many branches of the service all trying to do something like this, you realize how quickly unraveled things can come. It's very, very difficult for anybody to kind of command and control something this chaotic.
What about inside the Pentagon itself, inside the military? A bit of confusion earlier. Do we know where Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld is, for example?
I don't know where he is right now. I've seen him twice over here today, but I haven't seen him recently. The Joint Chiefs, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was over here a little earlier as well. Basically, I think this is just, the hard work of getting this fire extinguished and getting people in there to find the dead and hopefully anybody who may still be surviving. I would think by now the fire people probably would have been able to find any living survivors.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, Noah.
NPR's John McChesney talking with us from the Pentagon.
We're going We can tell you where Donald Rumsfeld is. He is at the White House. He is apparently giving a briefing to reporters, and we will take you to that briefing just as soon as we possibly can. Mr. Rumsfeld is attempting to talk about what the kind of attack that occurred at the Pentagon and who is responsible for it. He has, according for the picture that I can see on television, he is there's a shield, and behind him he appears to be at the Pentagon. Here's Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld.
Kind enough to come down and has been with us. We've very recently had a discussion with the President of the United States. Chairman Hugh Shelton has just landed from Europe. Secretary of the Army Tom White, who has a responsibility for incidents like this as executive agent for the Department of Defense, is also joining me. It's an indication that the United States government is functioning in the face of this terrible act against our country. I should add that the briefing here is taking place in the Pentagon. The Pentagon's functioning. It'll be in business tomorrow. I know the interest in casualty figures, and all I can say is it's not possible to have solid casualty figures at this time. And the various components are doing roster checks, and we'll have information at some point in the future, and as quickly as it's possible to have it, it will certainly be made available to each of you. I'll be happy to take a few questions after asking First General Shelton if he would like to say anything, and then we will allow the others to make a remark or two.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Ladies and gentlemen, as the Secretary just said, today we have watched the tragedy of an outrageous act of barbaric terrorism carried out by fanatics against both civilians and military people, acts that have killed and maimed many innocent and decent citizens of our country. I extend my condolences to the entire Department of Defense families, military and civilian.
You're listening to General Hugh Shelton, who is chairman of the Joint Chiefs,
who lost loved ones. I think this is indeed a reminder of the tragedy and the tragic dangers that we face day in and day out, both here at home as well as abroad. I would tell you up front, I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
Chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Carl Levin.
This is Senator Carl Levin of Michigan, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee.
Recovery and helping the injured and the families of those who were killed is matched only by our determination to prevent more attacks and matched only by our unity to track down, root out, and relentlessly pursue terrorists, states that support them, and harbor them. They are the common enemy of the civilized world. Our institutions are strong, and our unity is palpable.
Senator John Warner.
Thank you. As a past chairman, preceding Carl Levin,
the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, was holding a news conference at the Pentagon. We have just heard from the Secretary and then from General Hugh Shelton of the Joint Chiefs, who said that there would be a military response, although he said that he was not prepared to discuss what it would be. He said, your military is ready. And Senator Levin then told us that the Republicans and Democrats are completely united in the effort to do something about what has happened today in the United States, the worst terrorist attack ever.
And as we have heard from Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, it reminds us that President George W. Bush is expected to address the nation later this evening as well. We're joined now by NPR's diplomatic correspondent, Mike Schuster. Mike, this is not the first time the World Trade Center was the target of a terrorist attack.
No, that's true, Robert.
A little history here.
In 1993, there was a bomb that was exploded at the World Trade Center, and at that point only 6 people were killed, but hundreds were injured. 4 Muslims were arrested for that and put on trial, and in the investigation afterwards, it became clear that, in fact, their intention was to topple the World Trade Center. So that's a very important starting point to maybe understand, perhaps, who may have been responsible for this. Go ahead,
by the way, clear from the trial why the World Trade Center? What it signified to them that they wanted to topple these buildings?
I'm not sure. I think that it was a big symbol, a big target, and something that would be spectacular. And I think that issue of spectacular action since 1993 in terrorist acts against the United States is something that has motivated terrorists and those who are planning these things. In the Millennium Plot, which emerged in late December 1999, it seems clear that whoever was whoever brought those explosives from Canada into Washington and ultimately Los Angeles International Airport was the target, that was going to be done in coordination with an attack on a U.S. warship in Yemen, which didn't occur at that point, and attacks on U.S. tourists in Jordan. So this notion of coordination and the effect of such coordinated attack on the psychology of the United States has been clearly in terrorist minds for some years now.
Any other aspects of today's attacks that you see that are similar to terrorist actions in the past?
I think that the one thing that we have to look at as well is who might have been responsible, and there's another connection to the World Trade Center, and that's in the person of Ramzi Youssef, who is believed to have been the mastermind of the first attack on the World Trade Center. He was kidnapped, in effect, by U.S. agents in Pakistan, taken to New York and put on trial and convicted for masterminding that. And Youssef himself, in the early 90s, was discovered to be plotting against perhaps a dozen U.S. airlines in the Far East to have coordinated attacks as well. So there's this issue of aviation, hijacking, and coordinated attacks that seems to have culminated in this attack today.
But I mean, isn't there a qualitative difference, though, here, in that these weren't just attacks on airlines? These were 4 hijackings by people who, it seems, were skilled enough to actually pilot these aircrafts, their targets.
There's no question, but there are camps in Afghanistan and Pakistan that have trained terrorists. They have been soldiers in Afghanistan, soldiers in Pakistan, and other parts of the Islamic world. They could very well have piloting skills as well as explosive skills, and they may have been mustered if, in fact, those are the sources of this attack for what happened today.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Okay, Robert.
NPR diplomatic correspondent Mike Schuster. Linda?
Within the past few minutes, the president has arrived back in Washington. He landed at Andrews Air Force Base, and he plans to address the country in just over 2 hours' time. NPR's White House correspondent Don Gagne joins us now. Don, do we know what the president wants to say?
We can assume that he has a couple of goals this evening. First, he needs to reassure the nation that the institutions of this country, that the federal government is functioning, and that his team of national security advisors and his cabinet and he himself are addressing this situation, and that appropriate emergency response measures have been taken. There's that, but there will also be an element of I'm sure very unvarnished, very very tough talk about the need to, as he said in very brief remarks that he made earlier in the day, hunt down and use the full force of the U.S. government to find out who is responsible for what the White House has called cowardly and despicable acts.
Don, it seems extraordinary that the president has waited this long. The attacks took place hours ago, this morning, at around rush hour, Eastern Daylight Time. And the president has, except for speaking briefly, as you just said,
right,
The president has not made that reassuring appearance, has not said what the United States may do.
I think that is why he is coming back tonight to make these statements. I think the White House is also picking up a sense out there that people need to hear from the president tonight.
I wondered if there might be some strategic reason for waiting.
I think that there were concerns about his safety and the security surrounding the president of the United States. They needed to make sure they had him in a place. He left Florida hastily this morning. We were told he was going to an undisclosed location. That's when he landed at the air base in Louisiana, where we got the longest comments we've had from him so far. But then again, it was off to another undisclosed location, and he's suddenly at the Strategic Air Command out in Omaha. And they clearly have decided over the course of these past several hours that it is important for him to look into the TV camera this evening and sit before the microphone and talk to all of us and the American public.
Thanks very much.
Mm-hmm.
NPR's White House correspondent, Don Gagne.
The attacks on the World Trade Center building in New York and the Pentagon in Washington are significant not only for their size, but also for the apparent planning and resources that made them possible. Alan Brinkley is a professor of history at Columbia University in New York City. He says today's events will force the country to view its relationship with the rest of the world differently, even as we make efforts to find those responsible for the attacks.
I think what makes this so extraordinary is the enormous scale of what happened today and the obvious massive conspiracy that was behind it, the large-scale coordination. I mean, so many things happened that are so difficult to do today that it really does make one feel that there's a much larger force at work in this event than was at work in the Oklahoma City bombing or the first World Trade Center bombing or any of the other sort of scattered terrorist events we've had in the United States.
You have to ask yourself if somebody was able actually to successfully hijack, more or less successfully hijack 4 aircraft, commercial airliners, today in the morning, why couldn't they have done it 2 months ago?
Clearly they have found some way around the security mechanisms we've developed. The airports from which these planes were hijacked are not low-security airports. So, I mean, I think that's what is going to take some time to sink in our national psyche is the magnitude of this event and the total secrecy within which it had been shrouded.
There have been comparisons made and will continue to be made with Pearl Harbor almost 60 years ago. 2,000 people died, and America begins an involvement in a world war. Is it a fair comparison today?
Well, it's a fair comparison and an unfair comparison. I mean, this is not an act of war in any conventional sense. I don't think anybody imagines that there will be an invasion of the United States or that large-scale military activity will at least immediately follow this. One of the central characteristics of our culture throughout our history has been our sense of being protected by the two oceans, that we're somehow separated from the rest of the world and safer in a way than the rest of the world. But I think what this does is demonstrate the falsity of that assumption. We are not protected from the rest of the world. We're part of the world, and that a terrorist event of this scale, which has never happened in any part of the world, to my knowledge, nothing of this magnitude has happened in any other nation, has happened here. It's going to be a very hard thing, I think, for Americans to assimilate.
Professor Brinkley, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
Alan Brinkley teaches American history at Columbia University.
We've talked during the course of today about the 4 domestic commercial airliners which were hijacked this morning. They were American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles, which crashed into a tower of New York's World Trade Center at about 8:45 this morning. That plane was carrying 81 passengers, 9 attendants, and 2 pilots. Nearly 20 minutes later, the other tower was struck by United Airlines Flight 175 from Boston to Los Angeles. It was carrying 56 passengers, 2 pilots, and 7 attendants. Both towers burned and collapsed. A third building in the World Trade Center collapsed this afternoon. American Airlines Flight 77 from Washington Dulles to Los Angeles crashed into the Pentagon at about 9:40 this morning. The plane was carrying 58 passengers, 4 flight attendants, and 2 pilots. We will be following this story throughout the rest of the day and tonight. You're listening to special coverage from NPR News.
This is special coverage from NPR News of today's terrorist attacks in New York City and Washington. I'm Noah Adams.
And I'm Linda Wertheimer.
And in New York, I'm Robert Siegel. Today, the United States was hit by the worst terrorist act in history. 4 commercial jets were hijacked and crashed, 3 of them into their apparent targets, the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon just outside Washington, D.C. A 4th airliner crashed in Pennsylvania. Hundreds of people were aboard the planes that crashed, and the death toll could be in the thousands. Moments ago, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld spoke to reporters at the Pentagon.
There is no question but that the attack against the United States of America today was a vicious, well-coordinated, a massive attack against the United States of America.
New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani also held a news conference about an hour ago.
A situation like this, a tragedy like this, instills lots of feelings of anger and hatred, and I'd ask the people of the city not to have those feelings right now or ever. I mean, the reality is that hatred and insanity and prejudice caused this situation probably. And we have a lot of people in the city of all different backgrounds and all diverse religions, and they're not responsible for this. Whoever is responsible for this came from outside the city of New York.
To New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani.
Marianne McCune is a reporter with member station WNYC in New York. Right now she's at the major Triage Center just north of the World Trade Center. It's a makeshift center handling people being brought out of that building. Marianne McCune, tell us what's going on right now. What can you see?
Well, there have been groups of rescue workers that have been waiting for the debris to settle after the last collapse of 7 World Trade Center. It was the last bit that collapsed a little more than an hour ago.
7 World Trade Center that's not one of the towers. It's a separate building, yes.
That is the bottom of one of the towers.
I'm sorry, go on.
That happened a little after 5. There was another boom, and everyone here at the Triage Center came running toward the building we're out in front of, running for cover, because it looked like the smoke was coming up this way. I think that people feared that they would get buried, like some of the people have been describing who have come out of the collapse of the World Trade Center. But they moved this Triage Center up here in order to avoid being affected by that last collapse. They were actually expecting it, and now there's still gray smoke filling the sky where once we would see the Twin Towers. The skyline has this big hole in it. But here, there are groups of rescue workers that have been waiting to go out and waiting for the debris to settle so they could go out and start to try to find people. Just a few minutes ago, a few dozen New Jersey State Police loaded into a bus. They were wearing emergency helmets and oxygen masks and equipped even with night vision devices. They're expected to move large pieces of steel and debris and hopefully find people and then bring them here where there are ambulances, doctors, counselors, volunteers, all waiting to make use of themselves, hoping there's still a chance for them to use their expertise to help people.
I know you were in Lower Manhattan throughout this afternoon. What was it like? What could you see happening there?
Everyone I spoke to was coming as fast as they could away from the collapse. Some people had this gray ash sort of caked into their hair all over their bodies. There were some rescue workers who were washing in a fountain in Foley Square, which is just north of City Hall. They told terrible stories. The worst, I think, are of seeing people jumping out of very high windows on the World Trade Center. Some people talked about being almost buried in debris. Since then, I've seen people walking around, like, for example, with gauze taped over their eyes. I think there are a lot of eye injuries. But I've also seen an incredible volunteer effort. New Yorkers have been gathering impromptu at the police barricades. They've just been coming south as they heard of this disaster. And there was one area, also in Foley Square, where people were dividing into people who had medical expertise, people who had military expertise. people who wanted to give blood. There was even a group taking scaffolding from a building site and making stretchers, hammering and nailing together stretchers. Mayor Giuliani earlier commended New Yorkers for coming together, and I've seen that very vividly today.
Thank you, Marianne.
Thanks.
Marianne McCune, a reporter with member station WNYC in New York City.
Our colleague Robert Siegel is also in New York City and has been out on the streets today. Robert, first, are you looking in New York at general chaos in the city, or has it been relatively orderly?
Well, under the circumstances, I think you'd have to say it's relatively orderly, although I guess order would be it wouldn't be one's first reaction to the scene today, as all of the millions of people who come into Manhattan to work, a disproportionate number of them concentrated downtown in the financial district, then tried to get out and get back home. So orderly might be going too far, but I think that in terms of the sort of disorder that one might have feared, panic, looting, that sort of thing, no, it hasn't been that way at all. And as you heard from Marianne McCune, I saw people turning out in droves at Bellevue Hospital, volunteering to give blood, wanting to do something positive, constructive, helpful today.
People have been trying to get out of Manhattan, and in fact, the city officials have urged people to go home if they can. Mass transit isn't running. How are people leaving?
Well, some of them are walking. They're walking through Manhattan. They're walking across the bridges into Brooklyn, if that's where they live. At one point today, the Queens Midtown Tunnel opened up, and people with vans were filling up with as many passengers who could fit in. I was there when one big bus came around and just would take everybody who was lined up, as many as could fit into the bus, to one spot. But at Grand Central Station, for example, where I was earlier in the day at the terminal, people were trying to find trains. The station was locked at 11 o'clock in the morning. I met a gentleman who was trying to get on a plane for Scarsdale, and I just called him up. It took him, he told me, until 2:45, from at 11 a.m. until 2:45 p.m., to make it to Scarsdale in Westchester, after the trains had finally started running. And there are a million stories like that all around New York today of people who waited for some opportunity to get home and finally found one.
We've been hearing about tremendous amounts of soot and ash and the debris of paper, the explosion from the World Trade Center that has just created immense clouds of dust, obscured the sun. What is it like now as the sun is setting?
No, well, where I am, and I haven't been close enough to the area way downtown to see where all has been blanketed with ash and where the sky was blackened. But I've seen cars come out of there encrusted with ash. And as you walk along 42nd Street, which, again, this is several miles north of the southern tip of Manhattan, you look down Lexington Avenue, down 3rd Avenue, down 2nd Avenue, and everywhere you see the buildings at the far end of downtown, between them this huge cloud. And it is as high as a skyscraper, and it is hanging there. And it hangs there literally, physically, and in many other more figurative ways over New York today.
Robert, thanks very much.
Sure.
Our colleague Robert Siegel, who is in New York City.
Here in Washington, NPR's Steve Inskeep has been checking out reports of car bombs and other disturbances during this day. He spent most of his time at the Pentagon, where one of the hijacked planes crashed into that building shortly after 9:30 this morning. Steve, let's go back and establish the timeline for that incident, please.
Well, this began shortly after the World Trade Towers were bombed or attacked this morning, Noah. People were actually beginning to respond to that here inside the Pentagon, which is where I am now. Military employees were flipping on televisions after the second plane hit the second tower, it became clear to everyone here that it was a terrorist incident, and they were preparing to respond to that. And then people inside this building felt a tremendous explosion, saw fire, the building filled with smoke, and they raced to deal with it. As a matter of fact, a number of reporters have been brought into the building for this news conference with Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld a short time ago, and I can tell you that this part of the building, and this is the world's largest office building, or it was when it was built, and I'm some distance away from where the airplane struck, and yet
Steve,
this part of the building is still filled with smoke.
Thank you, Steve. We're going now to hear from Attorney General John Ashcroft, who's speaking.
We will not tolerate such acts. We will expend every effort and devote all the necessary resources to bring the people responsible for these acts, these crimes, to justice. Now is the time for us to come together as a nation to offer our support, our prayers for victims and for their families, for the rescue workers, for law enforcement officials, for every one of us that has been changed forever by this horrible tragedy. The following is a summary of the known facts surrounding today's incidents. American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston for Los Angeles, hijacked by suspects armed with knives. This plane crashed into the World Trade Center. United Airlines Flight 175 departed Boston for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 77 departed Washington Dulles for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon. United Airlines Flight 93 departed Newark for San Francisco, was hijacked and crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Crime scenes have been established by the federal authorities in New York, in Washington, D.C. area, in Pittsburgh, in Boston, and in Newark. The full resources of the Department of Justice, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the U.S. Attorney's offices, the U.S. Marshals Service, the Bureau of Prisons, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Office of Justice Programs are being deployed to investigate these crimes and to assist survivors and victim families. Thousands of FBI agents in all of the field offices across the country and in the international Legat offices, assisted by personnel from other Department of Justice agencies, are cooperating in this investigation. The FBI has established a website where people can report any information about these crimes. That address is www.ifccfbi.gov. That address again, www.ifccfbi.gov. Individuals can report any information they know about these crimes to that website. It takes courage for individuals to come forward in situations like this, and I urge anyone with information that may be useful and helpful to authorities to use this opportunity. The Office of Victims of Crime has established a toll-free 800 number for family and friends of victims. They can call 800-331-0075 to leave contact information for a future time when more information is available, to find out information about a victim, or to find out information about the rights of victims and the services available to victim survivors and victim families. The determination of these terrorists will not deter the determination of the American people. We are survivors, and freedom is a survivor. A free American people will not be intimidated, nor will we be defeated. We will find the people responsible for these cowardly acts, and justice will be done. Tommy.
The Attorney General of the United States, Attorney General Ashcroft, who's just been speaking about the investigations that are going to take place and the various federal government entities that will be pointed at this investigation, including the FBI. Barb Bradley is here with us today. She has been covering the FBI and watching over what they have been willing to say so far about what they know. And I gather that it has not been much, Barbara.
No, there's not been much at all. They've basically said we're investigating and we're looking after the victims of the crime and we're coordinating with other agencies. What Attorney General Ashcroft said right now is really the only real solid information we've had, and a lot of it was updates. It's probably the first time that we have confirmed from an official source that there were knives on one of the flights. That information, I believe, there were knives on one of the flights, and that one went from Boston to L.A. and crashed into the World Trade Center. We also know that the terrorists use knives in the flight that crashed in the Pentagon. We know that because Barbara Olson, the wife of Theodore Olson, the Solicitor General, called her husband and gave that fact right before the crash. So we're little by little we're going to get a little bit of information. What weapons they used, that kind of thing. It's very slow.
And there is so far no declaration of responsibility that we know about, and the Attorney General did not provide any information about who might have caused these things to happen.
No, there are just a lot of rumors, and a lot of people point to Osama bin Laden, but they've not confirmed that. They just call them terrorists and kind of faceless enemies. So it's going to be. I should say though that when you talk to terrorist experts, they say that this has Osama bin Laden's fingerprints all over it, in the sense that the kind of 1-2 punch that we saw here, the World Trade Center, and then the Pentagon was similar to the 1-2 punch that we saw with the 2 U.S. embassies in Africa. So there appear to be similarities here, and he is a kind of a logical suspect.
And an attack that is large, that is extraordinary in scale, of the sort of thing that apparently Osama bin Laden has talked to newspaper editors and has given interviews indicating that he had something big in the works.
Yes, apparently there have been a couple of warnings just in the last 3 weeks about something like this happening. He has a lot of resources. As you know, he's a very wealthy Saudi billionaire, so he can fund this kind of activity. Apparently he trains pilots. He has lots of money. He can do the logistics. He's quite an organized fellow, and apparently he's been talking about this kind of thing for a while.
Well, after a day of not knowing what was going on and not hearing from any officials in the federal government, we have heard very recently from Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and now from Attorney General John Ashcroft, and apparently we will hear this evening in perhaps about an hour and a half from President Bush. So we're getting a little bit more information, official information. Thanks very much. NPR's Barbara Bradley.
You're welcome.
On Capitol Hill, this was supposed to be a week to debate the defense budget. Instead, this morning the Capitol was evacuated and closed down. Lawmakers wondered what the carnage of this day says about America's intelligence capability. NPR's Peter Overby has a report.
At mid-morning, there was a stunned calm on Capitol Hill. 2 Republican senators and a few staff members stood across the street from the evacuated Capitol and listened to the radio. Chuck Hagel of Nebraska is a Vietnam veteran on the Foreign Relations Committee. John Warner is a World War II vet and ranking Republican on the Armed Services Committee. First, Senator Hagel.
This country has been changed forevermore. This is the second Pearl Harbor. It's that serious. When you think about what has happened here today, it's as serious as what happened at Pearl Harbor. Different kind of an enemy, different time. This is an attack on America.
They just hit the State Department.
Really?
That's what somebody told me. It's a carefully coordinated attack. It's remarkable, the volume of these things, and I don't know, somehow the intelligence community, I don't know, we'll have to see.
As concerned as Warner might be, he and most other members of Congress are in no rush to second-guess America's intelligence network. A few Democrats pointed out, quietly, that they want to shift some $800 million from Star Wars missile defense to anti-terrorism work. That was supposed to be debated in a committee meeting this morning. But conservative Republican Dana Rohrabacher of California lashed out at what he called the biggest intelligence failure of his lifetime. He blamed the administration of former President Bill Clinton.
We should do a clean sweep. We've got to hold those people who hold cushy jobs in the senior executive level of our well-paid intelligence operations, to sweep them away and do some major reform. We can't just let this get away by saying, oh, there's nothing we could have done. There's a lot we could have done to prevent this, and it's a disgrace that our country hasn't done it.
But Rohrabacher was out on a limb. More typical was Arizona Republican Jon Kyl on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Like President Bush and many other lawmakers, he talked about protecting the homeland.
It is very unfortunate but true that it takes incidents like this to focus people's attention on the fact that we've got a big job to do in this country, and that's to protect our homeland. A lot of voices have been saying that, but because we appear to be safe and secure, we have other priorities. We need to increase our spending on intelligence. We need to increase our intelligence gathering and analytical capability. We need to increase our ability to infiltrate terrorist organizations, and then we need to have better plans on how to deal with attacks once they occur. It's my hope that this incident, if there's anything good that comes out of this, it will be that it will refocus our attention on this first priority.
For members of Congress, the first priority today was to demonstrate that the congressional branch of government might have been temporarily out of its building, but it isn't out of business. As the tragedy of the day sinks in, the debate over intelligence operations has just begun. Peter Overby, NPR News, the Capitol.
To recap briefly the story of today's terrorist activity, the worst in history, it struck important financial and military centers. Deaths and injuries are expected to be in the thousands. 4 commercial domestic flights were hijacked, 2 American Airlines flights and 2 United Airlines flights. All 4 were deliberately crashed. 2 destroyed the World Trade Center towers in New York City. 1 crashed into a field 80 miles outside of Pittsburgh. 1 smashed into the headquarters of the U.S. military, the Pentagon. This evening, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said it is too early to give estimates of those killed, but said they will not be few. He also said that
This is special coverage from NPR News. In Washington, I'm Linda Wertheimer.
I'm Noah Adams.
And in New York, I'm Robert Siegel. One of the 4 planes hijacked today, the one that did not reach its target, was United Airlines Flight 93 from Newark to San Francisco. It crashed in Pennsylvania. There were 45 people on board when the jet slammed into a grassy field. NPR's Ken Barkis is about a quarter of a mile from the crash site in south-central Pennsylvania. It's about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Ken, how densely populated is the area where the plane went down? What's it look like?
It really is very rural here. As I was coming up here, I actually saw more cows and cattle than I did people. This is corn country. This is the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. The plane actually seemed to crash in what is a reclaimed strip mine site. A lot of coal mining around here. The sun's going down now, Robert, and I think we're moving into the next phase here. The FBI special agent in charge says tonight is the night for what they call the forensic archaeologists. That'll give you some idea of the situation at the scene, and that they're actually going digging. They're bringing in huge diesel-powered lights to light up the scene. Tonight, they say the most important thing is to protect the crime scene. Tomorrow, they say they'll start to grid everything out and start to go over it foot by foot.
The governor of Pennsylvania, Tom Ridge, has spoken about this. What has he said?
That's right. He came in, he helicoptered in, he said that he had spoke with both Governor Pataki and Governor Gilmore and offered emergency resources, which they may be taking up. Some of the specialists from Search and Rescue from Pennsylvania will be going to those states. And he also appealed for people to make blood donations, saying that there's no way he thought that the cities could cover the need after the wounded get in.
Governor Pataki because the World Trade Center is in New York, and Governor Gilmore because the Pentagon is in Virginia, I assume, is
exactly
what the point was there. This was the flight, this is one of the flights, the one that crashed in Pennsylvania, from which I gather there were cell phone calls made by passengers describing what was happening.
Well, there's been a lot of back and forth about that. The FBI is very a bit cagey about that. They say there were no reports that they know of Mayday from the pilot. However, there does seem to be a call, at least from one passenger, who was apparently in a bathroom. In the plane. Now they're trying to make sure that call actually came from the plane. The FBI says they are trying to secure that 911 call tape and if they haven't already, they're trying to figure out what exact cell it went to, because as the plane keeps flying west, it goes in and out of different 911 zones. So they're trying to locate and secure that tape. They've also had some concerns here today about biohazards. It may be just a common thing, but the reason that the archaeologists have not been digging yet is because they have a lot of hazmat people here. They say they want to make sure it's clear before they start digging.
Is there any indication there at all whether the plane that was, after all, flying west toward San Francisco was still headed in that direction when it crashed, or had it turned around toward Washington or New York?
That question was asked repeatedly, and the FBI officials here, at least, could not say whether it had turned around or not. There were rumors about it turning around, but they believed that it was heading west at the time, but they didn't have better information than that.
Okay, Ken. Thank you.
Thank you.
NPR's Ken Barkis, who is just outside Shanksville, Pennsylvania. That's in the south-central part of the state, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh.
As people around the country watched and heard news of today's events unfold, they called their neighbors and relatives, hoping that no one they knew had been hurt, and tried to make sense of the incomprehensible. NPR's Lynn Neary has a report.
The images took a moment to absorb. It was the World Trade Center, but what was happening to it? Why was smoke pouring out of it? How could two planes have hit it within such a short amount of time? Then, a sickening feeling as reality sunk in, and the terrible news kept coming. The Pentagon on fire, rumors that the White House had been struck, and the State Department. Government buildings all over Washington were being evacuated, and just outside, right in front of this building, the fear was palpable.
Get back!
Yes, get back!
Well, I think we'll take their advice. Let's get back.
A van without a driver was parked in the middle of the street. The police were checking it for explosives and cordoning off the street, only adding to the confusion as office workers emptied out of nearby government buildings and tried to find a way to get home. Cindy Cheeks works for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
They told us to leave now, and we don't have anywhere to go. That's why I'm standing here looking stupid.
Where are you supposed to go?
Husband, home, Maryland. I can't get home. It's no metros running. It's no buses running. Look at all the congestion out here.
What's your reaction to all this, Cindy?
I'm scared. I'm frightened, really. It's horrible.
By noon, most public transportation was running, and a strange calm replaced the panic. A young woman named Becky took a cigarette break and contemplated the empty streets as the last workers left the building she managed.
It's very surreal around here, I think, right now. People are in shock. It's almost like an eerie sort of quiet, like it's too hard to believe that this is really happening.
Bob Sauerwein remembers what it was like on April 19, 1995, when a huge bomb exploded in his hometown. Sauerwein runs a small cafeteria near where the Alfred P. Murrah building once stood in Oklahoma City.
I was here during the bombing when the memorial was down there, and this building here shook as well. So I can imagine what them people in New York are going through right now. I just, it just tears my heart out when things like this happen to our country.
At the Oklahoma City Memorial, Executive Director Carrie Watkins says the staff wanted to stay open all day, but few visitors came, and by afternoon she decided to close down for safety reasons. Just as they were 6 years ago, says Watkins, the reverberations from today's attack will be felt across the country.
It leaves people with a sense of uncertainty. It leaves people with a sense of pride for their country. And I think as Americans we unite together and take a stand that we will not let terrorists defeat us. They'll hurt us. They'll break our hearts. They'll, hurt ourselves, but they're not going to defeat us as a country.
As stunning a blow as the Oklahoma City bombing was, today's attacks on the nation's capital and the country's financial center seem to have a more devastating effect on the national psyche. Deborah Margulies heard the news in Philadelphia.
The whole world looks to New York, and in 18 minutes, 20 minutes, half hour, they shut our country down. That I think is a little scary.
Brendan Olkus, a young DJ who works in a club in Philly, says his sense of the world will never be the same.
26 years old. I've lived pretty much my entire life in a relative state of peace. But I've always felt like, I've always felt safe, and I don't know that I've ever felt really patriotic. I mean, I've just sort of felt like I've existed. And today was the first time I ever felt like, wow, my homeland has been attacked.
Some sought refuge in prayer.
Let us pray, O God, giver of solace in the presence and hope for the future.
About a dozen people attended this prayer service at the Episcopal Cathedral of St. Mark in Salt Lake City, Utah. Michael Mitchell, a native of Utah, had just moved back after living in New York for 9 years.
I've been on the internet all day trying to be in touch with my friends, and she can't get through by phone. I've just been trying to be in touch with people and see if they're all right.
Now, says Mitchell, like most people, he's wondering about the U.S. response.
I'm scared now that we're going to retaliate in a way that's going to pull us into something much, much deeper, and that's something that really scares me. We then get in a state of, retaliation, and it just escalates. As I was sitting here today during the prayer service, I was thinking, how can we begin the forgiveness process right away and still grieve and still have, that righteous anger and still try and set things right. But I don't know that necessarily means that we, bomb the hell out of whoever did it.
It will take a long time for the emotions of today to settle in, for people to fully absorb what happened. But in the minutes and hours after the attacks occurred, there was a sharp sense of violation and a keen sense of uncertainty about what lies ahead. Lynn Neary, NPR News, Washington.
Daniel Benjamin is a former director of transnational threats for the National Security Council. He joins us now to discuss today's attacks on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon. Mr. Benjamin, from what you have seen, from the way this whole thing developed, does this give you any kind of a picture of who might have done it?
The universe of actors who might have pulled something like this off is fairly small. The amount of coordination, the discipline, the drill, the wherewithal to do it is available to only a few governments. In fact, I think many governments would have a very hard time finding the operatives to do this sort of thing, and to an even smaller number of terrorist organizations. Among the governments that might have an interest in doing this would be Iraq, possibly Iran, although I strongly doubt that they have an interest in picking a fight with the U.S., and frankly, I don't know who else. And Iraq's own intelligence service has been much degraded over the years. So I actually don't think that they're a likely candidate. The most likely candidate would have to be the network affiliated with Osama bin Laden.
Because they have the money and the sophistication, do you think, to pull off something like this?
They have shown through the last decade an ability to improve their tactics, to make use of very sophisticated planning, to think more imaginatively in a horrific sort of way than I think any terrorists we have seen before. The characteristics of this attack also indicate that bin Laden's group is the likely author. For one thing, the horrific number of casualties is characteristic of bin Laden. That's not the sort of thing that we saw from other more politically oriented terrorist groups. The multiple attacks that try to create a sort of psychological Tet offensive, if you will, the sense that there are bombs going off everywhere. You never know when they're going to stop and when it'll be safe to come out. That's also characteristic of bin Laden. And I think that the choice of symbols, the choice of targets is characteristic of bin Laden, two premier symbols of American power. It's also interesting that the World Trade Center was the target of Ramzi Youssef and his crew, and they have close affiliations with bin Laden, many of them trained in the same camps, as was revealed in the embassy bombings trial.
Some people who have studied this have suggested that there was just simply no question that there would be terrorist attacks on the United States, that the question was not that there would be, but when there would be. Do you have any sense of why now?
This particular time, I think that the timing was ultimately determined by the moment that they felt that they were operationally capable. It is possible as well that the start of a trial next week of one of bin Laden's senior lieutenants in New York, not far from the World Trade Center, also might have played a part. This is a man who's actually being tried for attacking a prison guard whom he grievously wounded, but who was one of his top officials and who was caught in Europe working to procure weapons of mass destruction.
There were no weapons of mass destruction involved in this. It was a hijacking, which is sort of an old-fashioned terrorist act, combined with the bomb moving. This is something we have never seen before. Very fast?
Well, we have seen planes crash into things. One crashed into the White House, I believe, in 1995. But this is a new style using existing technologies.
Thanks very much. Daniel Benjamin is a former Director of Transnational Threats for the National Security Council.
We'll continue our coverage in a moment on NPR.
This is special coverage from NPR News in Washington. I'm Linda Wertheimer.
And I'm Noah Adams. Frantic rescue efforts are underway tonight at the World Trade Center in New York City. Crews are inside the building searching for survivors, trying to recover bodies. Kenny Johanneman is a janitor in the World Trade Center. He was in the basement this morning when he heard the first explosion. Mr. Johanneman, tell us what you heard. What happened?
Well, what happened was I was going up to the elevator, and all of a sudden we heard a boom, and the elevator doors flew open, and one of the delivery guys came out. He was burnt up. So when I went to retrieve him, his skin just came right off, and we escorted him out. And as soon as we escorted him out, we were there for a couple of minutes, and all of a sudden the second bomb flew, the second plane hit. And all of a sudden, we looked up and we saw people jumping out of the towers, the first tower.
When the elevator opened, you heard that explosion. You probably thought you saw that the man was on fire.
Well, no, I was thinking of the person. I'm friends with the woman that was running the elevator, and I don't know where she is right now.
Oh, I see. I was going to suggest that you probably thought it was a small local fire.
He was yelling bomb.
Oh, he was?
Yes, he was yelling bomb, bomb, bomb. So when I grabbed him and he slid off me because of his skin was so burnt, I just got him out of there. I couldn't take any time to see if she was okay, which I'm worried about right now.
So you right away left the basement?
Yes, we proceeded to the supervisor's office. We all ran outside, and that's when the second plane hit.
And when did you start seeing bodies come from the building?
Well, when the second plane hit, about 2 minutes after that, that was when it hit the second building. The first building, we looked up and we saw bodies flying out of jumping out of the windows, and they were still alive because the arms were flailing and they were still appeared to be alive.
Were you concerned that you were perhaps too close to these buildings at that time?
No, I was worried about my coworkers. I was worried. We tried backtracking back in to go in to see if we could save anybody, and the police would not let us back in.
Now, you know the structure of those towers. Did you have any thought that one or the other might collapse?
No, I didn't. I thought it was structurally sound, but obviously it wasn't. But I was just, like I said, I was worried about my coworkers.
And then when the first tower goes down, what did you do?
Well, I ran around to see if I could see any ABM shirts, which is American Building Maintenance, to see if anybody was around, and I didn't see anybody, and that's when I got worried.
And where were you when the second one went down?
When the second one went down, that's when I was 2 blocks away, and that's when I started seeing people jump out of the buildings.
I see. Did you ever go much farther than 2 blocks away?
No, because the cops kept pushing us back. The police kept pushing us back because they were worried about our safety of the debris flying and stuff like that.
When you think back on it now, Mr. Johanneman, does it seem real to you? Does today seem like it was a real day?
Well, now it hit me because my supervisors told me that 5 of my coworkers passed away, so I'm pretty shaken up right now. I'm containing myself right now on the phone, but I guess as soon as I get off this phone, I'll be blubbering pretty much.
Were you working there in the building at the time of the bombing in 1993?
Yes, I was. When the first bomb hit, I was down in the basement, which is one below the concourse.
So this is the second time. Had you ever thought it could happen again?
No, I didn't.
And what could the future be like for you now? What will you do?
I have no idea. All I'm worried about is the families that have people passed away. I'm worried about my coworkers. I want to see who's alive, what happened, and I'm very concerned about the people that were in there.
Maybe there's a chance you could go down and help out tomorrow?
Yes, I would definitely do that.
Mr. Johanneman, thank you for talking with us, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
The federal government sent workers home mid-morning today, shortly after the American Airlines plane crashed into the Pentagon. Federal workers poured out of buildings in downtown Washington, creating a citywide traffic jam as they tried to make their way home adding to difficulties for ambulances and fire trucks trying to reach the Potomac River bridges on the way to the destruction at the Pentagon. Patricia Rivera of Denver and Phil Gentry of Portland, Oregon, were in the city for a meeting at the Small Business Administration. Their meeting was canceled for now, and they were walking toward the bridges.
First time in my life, I saw cops with guns, and I'm in the street, M16s, and I've never seen that.
You have to treat this almost as a war zone, and the safe thing is not to be where there's visible buildings that might be of interest to terrorists, and the subway would be one of those. So we're walking and trying to stay away from the main federal buildings.
Near the arena where Washington's basketball teams play, we ran into Erica Thornburg, who, along with some colleagues from the Veterans Administration, decided to go to lunch.
The streets are blocked, people aren't moving, the police are trying to direct traffic. Most of us don't have enough gas to get home if we're going to be sitting in traffic like this for 3 hours. So we might as well eat.
George Ray was walking away from the mall in the complex of federal office buildings hand in hand with his wife, Betty. He'd hiked over from his offices at Housing and Urban Development to find her.
I could see out my window the billowing smoke coming out of the Pentagon. This is terrible. There's panic in the streets. We'd never thought we would be attacked like this. Never, ever.
I think the worst part of it is trying to get in touch with your loved one. But as you can see, the streets are just packed. No one's moving. Cars are standing in place for half an hour or more, just still at the same stoplights.
From the glittering white obelisk of the Washington Monument to the immense dome of the Capitol, the Washington Mall looked almost normal. But the people drifting along its paths were workers sent home. Smoke was rising over the Smithsonian Museum from the fire at the Pentagon, and the white buildings bathed in bright sunshine were completely empty, evacuated, including the Capitol building and the 6 big office buildings that house members of the House and Senate. There was a loose cordon of Capitol Police keeping people off the grounds. A few people across Constitution Avenue gathered in the deep shade of the park. We passed a parked car where a dozen people were gathered around a car radio, and we stopped for a moment to listen as a limousine driver gave directions to pedestrians trying to get home.
Andrews is shut down.
So the Green Line is running.
Green Line is open.
Oh, okay.
This is my job. I know the city. I've been paying attention to what's been going on the radio, and every bit of information that I get, I just pass on. This is total gridlock right here.
That was Jess Pipkin, who parked his limousine on the mall this morning and tried to help.
Here is a review of the story we're reporting today. The headquarters of the U.S. military came under direct terrorist attack this morning. A commercial jetliner was hijacked and crashed into the side of the Pentagon. American forces around the globe were put on highest alert. The White House and the Capitol building were evacuated. This evening, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said it is too early to give estimates of the dead, but they will not be few. He also said the Pentagon is functioning and it will be in business tomorrow. 2 other hijacked planes were flown directly into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. President Bush will address the nation this evening at 8:30 Eastern Time. We will carry that address and will be following the story throughout the night. You're listening to special coverage from NPR News.
From NPR News, this is special coverage of today's terrorist attacks. I'm Robert Siegel in New York.
And in Washington, D.C., I'm Noah Adams.
And I'm Linda Wertheimer. Today, September 11th, 2001, the United States became the target of the worst terrorist attack in history.
Parallel attacks on the most potent symbols of American financial and military power. At 8:45 this morning, an American Airlines plane hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. About 20 minutes later, a second plane flew straight into the South Tower. Less than an hour later, both buildings had fallen.
About an hour after the first strike in New York, a plane crashed into the Pentagon, collapsing one side of the building. Another plane crashed in Pennsylvania. Hundreds of people were aboard the 4 aircraft that crashed. No one knows exactly how many people were in the World Trade Center when it collapsed. The death toll could be in the thousands.
President Bush will be speaking to the nation in about 30 minutes. About 1 hour ago, Attorney General John Ashcroft gave this briefing.
The following is a summary of the known facts surrounding today's incidents. American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston for Los Angeles hijacked by suspects armed with knives. This plane crashed into the World Trade Center. United Airlines Flight 175 departed Boston for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 77 departed Washington Dulles for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon. United Airlines Flight 93 departed Newark for San Francisco, was hijacked and crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Crime scenes have been established by the federal authorities in New York, in Washington, D.C. area, in Pittsburgh, in Boston, and in Newark. The full resources of the Department of Justice, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the U.S. Attorney's offices, the U.S. Marshals Service, the Bureau of Prisons, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Office of Justice Programs are being deployed to investigate these crimes and to assist survivors and victim families.
Attorney General John Ashcroft speaking at the White House this evening. And once again, we are expecting President Bush to speak at about 6:30.
At 8:45 this morning, New Yorkers were arriving at work, picking up a bagel or a cup of coffee on the way when today's first wave of calamitous news was announced. Newscasters reached for precedent. 60 years ago, a plane had crashed into the Empire State Building. People watched on television and also through the windows of their apartments and office buildings that face downtown, and they saw the event repeat itself at the second tower. It became clear that there was no precedent for what was happening today. It will no doubt be days before all the black boxes are retrieved and all the dead and injured are accounted for, and it will certainly be a lot longer than that before the people who were in downtown Manhattan this morning ever forget the experience. NPR's Melissa Block has been near the World Trade Center today, and she's here with me now. Melissa, of course, the target was symbolic in some respects, but just for the sheer density of people who would be in one spot, you couldn't find more people packed in a small area than around the World Trade Center.
Absolutely, both for those killed and for those who were able to witness what happened, people walking to work over the Brooklyn Bridge. I talked with a construction worker named Murray Goff, who was at a construction site just north of the Twin Towers, and he described he had flown in last night from West Virginia, where he lives. He was working on this site when he heard the first jet screaming low overhead the work site.
And we heard it go over, and we looked up, and then we heard the crash. Run out here and looked and seen the plane where it went into the side. We're standing here, can't believe it. Whenever the second plane crashed through the smoke into the other one, well, as soon as I seen that plane hit, I said it's a terrorist attack.
And then police and emergency workers were rushed downtown.
That's right. So they're all drawn to the scene. These planes have gone into the buildings. They go in to try to evacuate personnel. And later I saw just dozens of police cars that were driving around covered with debris, their windows caved in from the explosion. These were still the operating vehicles that they were using. I spoke with a Lieutenant Thomas Inez, who's with the Port Authority Police. He responded to the scene. He was there trying to rescue people. He saw people jumping off the highest floors of the Twin Towers after the planes crashed, and then he was there when the buildings came down.
I guess the scariest part was being covered in dust and not being able to see, and breathing through my hat. It was pitch black.
And you were breathing through your police hat?
My hat, yes, because that's all I had with me.
The people who were jumping, did you see them fall?
Unfortunately, yes. It's not something I would like to talk about, and unfortunately it's not something I'll ever be able to forget about. At first you thought it was pieces of the building falling, until you realize that they had arms and legs. And at this point, I really wouldn't want to say anything more about it.
He was off to give blood, I gather, later in the day.
I don't know about him, but I did speak with the parent of a young child who was picking him up from school. You saw a lot of parents rushing to schools to pick up their children. Michael Ruddy stopped to talk to me. His wife worked in the Trade Center until a year ago. What did you tell your son?
Excuse me. I'm very emotional about this. I explained to him that something very terrible had happened, that the World Trade Center, which he knows very well, because he used to call it Mama's building. I told him that it had been hit by an airplane and had now been destroyed, and it doesn't exist anymore. he's, I think, concerned because he sees how sad I am. He kind of sees the sadness. He sees the sadness in me, and I think he's a little concerned about that. I asked a policeman outside school, what can I do? I want to do something. I want to help. And he said, give blood. So I'm going to go over to maybe St. Vincent's and see if I could do anything.
And indeed, there were many people going to many hospitals in Manhattan offering to give blood. Melissa, you live here, you cover this city, you've seen all kinds of things in New York. How would you describe the way New Yorkers coped with this today?
I don't think, clearly no one's seen anything like it, and it was a mix of things. You did see a lot of people who were drawn down as spectators, people with cameras. There was the little moment of a Salvation Army team that was setting out trays of milk and cookies, but at the same time, horror on the faces of New Yorkers as they clustered around radios. Cars had their radios cranked. People just devastated by what had happened here today.
Thank you. NPR's Melissa Block.
NPR's Peter Kenyon joins us now. Let's go back to the morning crash at the Pentagon, Peter.
Well, law enforcement, officials say it was American Airlines Flight 77 en route from Dulles Airport in Virginia to Los Angeles that suddenly veered off course and smashed into the Pentagon. It ripped open a hole in the side of 3 of the 5 rings that you can see above ground on the Pentagon. Military officials said the fire was intense, the heat was blistering. At least 40 victims reported in local hospitals, 7 in critical conditions at a burn facility. Hard to get to the site because of the smoke and the fire. One victim from the plane has already been identified now. Barbara Olson, the wife of U.S. Solicitor General Theodore Olson, was aboard that flight. Law enforcement officials told the Associated Press Mrs. Olson called her husband from the plane and described the hijacking, saying that the hijackers were using knife-like instruments. Theodore Olson also confirmed that his wife was on board, saying he wished it wasn't so.
Now, to be clear about this, we had 2 planes hijacked that crashed into the Twin Towers in New York, and this would have been a hijacked aircraft also.
That's right. This one took off from Dulles Airport outside of Washington en route to Los Angeles and just immediately veered off and hit the Pentagon.
Especially shocking, this sort of attack on the Pentagon, the center of the military, and an attack really on the nation's capital.
It really was, Noah, and the rapid evacuation and the confusion around the city today was very telling. Tourists were being yelled at by agitated Secret Service agents, and it's kind of recognizing that confusion and how bad that might seem. The House and Senate leaders quickly gathered to say we're going to reopen the Capitol as soon as possible. President Bush, who had been traveling in Louisiana and Nebraska, decided to come back to Washington, where he's expected to address the nation tonight. And the military remains on high alert status. Military vehicles have been seen on the streets of Washington, D.C. We're not expecting a lot of details from President Bush on how the government will respond to this attack, but clearly there are expectations of something significant. I might mention in Israel today, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon called it a turning point in the war against international terror.
Let's add a bit here about the 4th hijacked plane of the day. It crashed outside Pittsburgh.
Virginia Congressman James Moran, he's a Democrat whose district includes the Pentagon. He was briefed by military officials today, and after the briefing he said that he thought that target was Camp David. The crash actually occurred about 85 miles northwest of Camp David, but there were, as you mentioned, 45 people on board, no expected survivors, and that crashed in a remote field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Peter. NPR's Peter Kenyon.
For the first time ever, all U.S. air traffic was shut down today. The planes involved in the 4 deadly crashes were hijacked from airports in Newark, Washington, and Boston. It's not yet clear how airport security in those cities was breached so dramatically, but the hijackings mean routine security procedures, from X-ray machines to employee background screening, will be scrutinized for vulnerabilities, and there may be limits to how much protection can be tightened. NPR's Emily Harris joins us now. Emily, first of all, do we know anything about how these teams managed to hijack the planes?
No real details yet, Linda. There's a lot of security measures in place at airports, but clearly the events today have proven that what we have now are breachable. The security measures go from everything to the questions you answer when you check in, to the cockpit door, which is supposed to be locked, to background checks of employees, metal detectors, all that sort of stuff. What's definitely going to happen here is a stepped up look at security measures. Although some people say, look, this isn't as much airport security as national security. Where was the intelligence that this was being planned?
How hard would it be to get, if it was in fact, if knives were used to hijack these planes? How hard would that be to get knives into an airplane?
Well, you do have metal detectors, obviously, that you go through, but there have been situations where those have been tested and breached. Their one real issue is the people who stand there, the scanners they're called, have an incredibly high turnover rate. They turn over at a rate of 100% a year nationally. So there's a lot more issues going on than do the X-ray machines work, for example.
These, whoever took these planes controlled them over long distances and flew them into specific targets, appeared to be pilots.
Yeah, it's clear to most security experts I've talked to that the people who did these attacks, planned them, were flying the planes. These planes are commercially available widely. It wouldn't be hard necessarily to get your hands on one and learn how to do it.
NPR's Emily Harris.
We'll continue covering the story of today's terrorist attacks in New York at the Pentagon and the crash near Pittsburgh in just a minute on All Things Considered from NPR News.
This is special coverage from NPR News on today's terrorist attacks. I'm Linda Wertheimer.
And I'm Noah Adams. To bring us up to date on the extent of the deaths and the injuries, we turn now to NPR's Rick Carr, who is in New York. Rick, can we put any number now, this evening, on the number of possible dead and injured in New York, and also in Washington at the Pentagon, and in the airplane crash in Pennsylvania?
Well, I'll start with the airplanes, Noah. We know that there were 266 people in total on those 4 aircraft. The first aircraft to hit the World Trade Center was American Airlines Flight 11. It was a Boeing 767. There were 92 people aboard. The second aircraft to hit was United Airlines Flight 175. Again, a 767, 65 people on board. In Washington, the plane that hit the Pentagon was American Airlines Flight 77. It's a 757, and there were 64 people aboard, and the downed plane in Pennsylvania was United Airlines Flight 93, and it had 45 people aboard.
Now, we're hearing that this evening late that hundreds of firefighters and police who were sent early to the World Trade Center in New York are now missing, and entire companies of firefighters.
That's right. A spokesperson for the firefighters union here in New York has said that of the 400 firefighters who were on the scene, about half of them are now missing. He said that there are whole companies missing, there are chiefs missing. Nobody's really certain how many people are missing in the wreckage, whether it's firefighters, police, or indeed people who were in the World Trade Center buildings, because the dust is so thick down there, the destruction is so complete. There was a report that moved on the wires this afternoon that's indicated that some people believe that emergency vehicles were actually driving over corpses that were buried in dust. There was just no way to tell how many people were there. There are reports now in New York that crews have gone into the area and are starting to look for survivors and for corpses.
We have been hearing throughout the afternoon the figure thousands who could be dead in the World Trade Tower bombing. What's your latest information?
The latest information is pretty much what we've been hearing all day long. It's educated guesswork at this point how many people there are. The New York Police Department has been saying this afternoon they estimate 10,000 or so people may have died in the explosions and in the collapse of the World Trade Center buildings. There are just too many questions right now about how many people had arrived. About more than 40,000 people work in those buildings. We don't know how many people had arrived at work. We don't know how many of them turned away when they saw the first explosion. We don't know how many of them successfully got out of the building after the first plane struck. We just don't know, and we won't really know until families around New York get a sense of who's actually returned home, the hospitals can coordinate information, and indeed that those crews can get in there and start trying to find any human remains that might be there.
And how are the hospitals dealing with this tragedy?
Well, there are 170 hospitals in New York City. They've all been put into action to take care of the wounded. We don't really have a sense of how many people there are in total that have been admitted to the hospitals, 600 or so as of this afternoon. Hospitals are reporting that 10 to 20% of those who are coming in are in critical condition, most of them suffering from cuts, scrapes, burns, and smoke and dust inhalation. The smoke and dust was just incredible, pouring over lower Manhattan and into Brooklyn, where indeed it felt like it was snowing for much of the afternoon.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Noah.
NPR's Rick Carr talking with us from New York.
With the death toll mounting from today's attacks, questions are mounting about who is responsible and when and how the U.S. might retaliate. We're joined now by Strobe Talbott, who was Deputy Secretary of State in the Clinton administration. Strobe Talbott, how does the United States go about determining who did this?
Quickly and carefully, without jumping to conclusions, but when we reach hard-headed judgments and we're sure of them, we have to act.
Well, act means many things. It could mean an international criminal investigation, as in the bombing at Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, or it could mean military retaliation. Would you assume at least military retaliation?
Yes, as long as we're sure that, first of all, the people we're retaliating against are indeed responsible, and second, that the retaliation will have a deterrent effect in the future. I mean, there is no question what the motive of the terrorists is here. It's to polarize. It's worse is better. It's to try to drive the United States either into its shell, which we cannot allow to happen, or to drive the United States into kind of lashing out in a way that will exacerbate exactly the sorts of tensions that terrorism feeds on. And we have to avoid both of those.
I mean, realistically speaking, can U.S. intelligence services figure out who did this without relying heavily on the intelligence services and police forces of countries in, say, the Middle East?
We have to look at this, as so many people have said during the course of the day, as an act of war, and we have to approach it as a kind of war. But we have to do it as we have done with wars in the past, as the leader of an alliance, the leader of a coalition, of the civilized world. And we have to make sure that our coalition partners and our allies include not only the Europeans, but also, and by the way, the Russians, who for geographical and other reasons presumably have both interests and influence here, but also on the moderate Arab states.
I mean, what you're describing is a lot closer to what President George Bush the Elder organized in response to the invasion of Kuwait than, say, the attacks that followed the bombings at the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania during the Clinton administration.
Well, all of us who lived through the acts of terrorism during the Clinton administration have thought a lot during the day about the parallels there and also the differences. This is, for a number of reasons, different, certainly in magnitude. In those earlier cases, we did rely, by the way, a lot on international cooperation, but that's going to be especially important now, given the essential fact here, Robert, which is that while we've all seen this as an attack on America, it's also an attack on the rest of the world. The consequences of what's happened today are going to be devastating for the international economy. Unless we can all gather together and put this into some kind of perspective and bring it under control. And that can only be done through multilateral international action led by the United States.
There's been much talk of suspicions that Osama bin Laden is behind all this. If he isn't, who else might be? Who's capable of doing such a thing?
He obviously belongs high on the list of suspects for all sorts of reasons. And I can only speak here on the basis of what's been in the public eye today, which has been horrifying. It looks as though the degree of coordination here has to have something more than a non-governmental or individual actor or group behind it. But that's just a judgment that so many of us feel in our gut watching it. We can't rule anything out. We certainly have to take account of the possibility that there are states, that is, that the fault for this lies in national capitals as well as with terrorist organizations.
Strobe Talbott, thank you very much for talking with us. Strobe Talbott, who was Deputy Secretary of State in the Clinton administration and is now Director of the Center for the Study of Globalization at Yale University in New Haven.
From NPR News, this is special coverage of today's tragic events in New York City and here in Washington, D.C. I'm Noah Adams with colleagues Linda Wertheimer in Washington, Robert Siegel in New York. President Bush is expected to address the nation in about a minute. Earlier today, President Bush said, "Freedom has been attacked. Freedom will be defended."
NPR's White House correspondent Don Gagne is here as well. Don, do you expect the president to talk about some kind of response?
We expect him to talk about the fact that there will be a response and that the U.S. is committed and confident that it will find who is responsible and that there will be a response. But in terms of a specific response, they're still assessing the intelligence information they're receiving at this point.
We'll go immediately to the president as soon as he begins to speak. But first of all, could you tell us where he's been today?
He has been in Florida. He started his day, went to an air base in Louisiana, all as part of a precautionary move. He ended up in Nebraska outside Omaha at the Strategic Air Command before this evening, 7 o'clock, coming back to the White House, landing on the South Lawn and preparing for these remarks tonight.
The president will be speaking from the White House. Has Don... Here is the president.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you. Good night, and God bless America.
President George Bush, speaking from the White House this evening after a day which has seen the worst terrorist attacks in history occur in the United States. The World Trade Center destroyed, the Pentagon, part of the Pentagon destroyed. Don Gagne is here with us in the studio. Don, the president set this up as a conflict between good and evil. And particularly in biblical terms, talking about the valley of the shadow of death. He talked about terrorism as a war and said that the United States would win the war against terrorism. He said that the United States has stood down enemies before. Very sort of militant kinds of prose from the president, but no plan, no specifics.
No specifics, because they don't feel prepared at all to offer any specifics yet. They are getting intelligence information. There are intercepted phone calls. They're getting intelligence reports of phone calls saying targets have been hit. But Ari Fleischer today, the president's press secretary, talking on Air Force One on the way back to Washington from Nebraska, told reporters that they have to be very careful that the information they have is accurate before any response is taken. But again, the president was attempting to show that once they come to that point, once there is a degree of certainty that there will indeed be a very strong response, and he made the point tonight that no distinction between the terrorists, he said, who committed these acts and those who harbored them will be made. There will be no distinction, so they can all expect a response.
The president appeared to wish to reassure the American people that the government would be open for business, that financial institutions would remain strong.
The American economy will be open for business tomorrow. That was the second part of this speech, that the American way of life is not threatened, that life goes on here, that we will not retreat.
Don, it's hard to say how any administration could prepare for a day like this, but do you have the feeling that there was a confident reaction from the beginning, from the Bush White House? He was in several different places. He's come a little bit late to Washington to make this address tonight. What do you think?
It's hard to say. They were thrown by this like the rest of the country. He did make the point tonight that when they got the first report that the first plane had crashed into the one tower of the World Trade Center, that they put the emergency procedures into effect. But then, and perhaps it's the nature of something like this, the president was out of sight and out of touch for a good bit of the day, except for very, very short statements that he made. One from Louisiana, one earlier in the day, very brief from Florida. The White House said that was all necessary as part of the caution that has to be taken while the national security team assesses the situation and the real threats. But they did feel compelled to have him make this national broadcast tonight.
Our colleague Robert Siegel is standing by in New York. Robert?
I was just, first of all, Don, remarking on that statement by the president that we'll make no distinction between terrorists who did this and those who harbor them. Do we assume that means not only bands of terrorists, but nations where they have bases?
He didn't go into any specifics, but I think that is a reasonable assumption to make. If they feel they have the evidence drawing those kinds of connections, I think we may indeed see responses against nations.
Let's turn now to our diplomatic correspondent, Mike Schuster. Mike Schuster, if indeed, as the president says, the U.S. military is powerful and it is prepared and will make no distinction between terrorists who did this and those who harbor them, which nations might be worried about that at this point?
Well, obviously, Afghanistan, Robert, is number one on the list because that's where Osama bin Laden lives, and that's where his organization, Al-Qaeda, maintains training camps. And it's under intense scrutiny by U.S. satellite sensors, surveillance satellites, and other sensors that can pick up communications. Iraq would also be on that list. I'm not sure that Iraq would necessarily be second, but Iraq would be on that list, given at least some signals and hints about Iraqi involvement in the previous World Trade Center bombing. Sudan could be on that list. Sudan was hit by an American cruise missile attack in 1998, along with Afghanistan, when the two bombings occurred at U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The list is not very large, Robert. It's quite small, given given where suspicion has fallen. I'm not sure that there are any other nations beyond that.
You mentioned the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. In the end, do we know what countries were involved in that act of terrorism?
No. In fact, the authorities, when they prosecuted the 4 and ultimately 6 people for that bombing, they didn't attempt to link them to nations. There were a number of terrorism experts that did feel that there was that the Iraqi hand was perceived in that, but the Clinton administration chose not to make that connection. And over the 8 years since the first World Trade Center bombing, the view has pretty much stayed the same, that bin Laden and before him the World Trade Center bombers and Ramzi Youssef, who was believed to be the mastermind of that bombing and who's in prison now in the United States, were not acting with state sponsorship, that they were acting on their own. And the focus on bin Laden has really intensified that view that this has been something that this has been a phenomenon that bin Laden and other independent actors have really pressed forward. I think that because of the details and the extraordinary coordination and synchronization of these acts today, it's going to push U.S. officials to focus much more on the possibility that there was state sponsorship for these acts.
Yes, it would seem that the great difference between what happened today and what happened either at the U.S. embassies or at the World Trade Center in '93 or at Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia is that these weren't trucks full of bombs that pull up in front of a building, but hijackings that involve people obviously capable of, first of all, penetrating airport security in some way with some sort of weapons, it seems, and then piloting the aircraft into their targets. Very sophisticated stuff.
It certainly seems very sophisticated, but the number of people who actually carried out these operations today could still be small. That's what terrorism experts caution. And we don't have any information about how they got on the plane with weapons that they could then commandeer the planes, whether there were arms involved or explosives involved. So terrorism experts still caution that without further information that gives us a clearer picture of how this was done today, an ultimate conclusion can't be drawn.
It would seem from the experience of the 1993 explosion that an ultimate conclusion might not be drawn 10 years from now.
That's possible, although there was an investigation and there was a trial and there was a lot of information. And then when Ramzi Youssef was essentially kidnapped by U.S. agents from Pakistan and brought to the United States, U.S. authorities have said that he bragged about the operation and gave a good deal of detail about how he masterminded and how his people carried out the first bombing of the World Trade Center. There was also a good deal of information that's emerged about particularly at the trial this year, about the embassy bombings in Africa. And so I think U.S. officials believe that they will learn a great deal more about what took place today.
Thank you, Mike.
You're welcome, Robert.
Mike Schuster, NPR's diplomatic correspondent.
John Parakini is with us. He is the executive director of the Washington office of the Monterey Institute. He's writing a book about Osama bin Laden. He's the author of a report on the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. Mr. Parakini, first of all, what do you think about the notion that this act was so sophisticated that it might actually have been state-sponsored?
I think it's a good point, and it's worth thinking about. We would have to say, however, that the World Trade Center bombing of '93 was a sophisticated act, or that the bombings of the embassies in two different countries, one right after another in 1998, was a sophisticated operation. There's no indication in either of those instances that states were party to that, but nothing should be ruled out at this moment.
Let's go back to what the president said. Was there anything that you felt was missing from that statement? Did you expect to hear something about retaliation or some presidential act?
I think the president and indeed other cabinet officials are striking just the right tone at this moment. Don't incite panic. Don't tip all the cards about what we might do next. Don't rule out any tools that might be in our counterterrorism toolbox. So I think they're doing pretty well under what are unprecedented circumstances.
The difficulty of not knowing what happened and not knowing who caused it leaves the United States in a sort of an impotent position, though, doesn't it, to have had something so dreadful happen and to have no response?
It leaves us impotent if we only think about one tool that is striking back. And indeed, that's a feeling that many Americans, I'm sure, feel this evening. This is tragic beyond imagination, and many people are angry. But I think the president and his other officials are showing the right approach. That is, we will pick our time. We will use a variety of tools, some of them diplomatic, some of them law enforcement, some of them military, some of them things that we can do on our own here in this on our own territory, improving our security at our borders, improving the air traffic security system. There are a number of things that we can do that don't involve kissing somebody with a cruise missile.
The president said that the United States will win the war against terrorism. He talked about it as a war. Did you see this as some sort of response to the notion that what has happened was very close to an act of war?
That's the one aspect of the president's statement that I found unfortunate. If this is al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, I think they do perceive it as a war, a clash of civilizations in which they are waging a war against us. But this is not a war for us. This is not like Pearl Harbor. This was a terrorist incident. We're going to reconstitute the working ability of the Pentagon. We're going to get things back together in New York City, and we're not engaged in a war. The moment we describe it as a war, asymmetric in character, we're beginning to give Osama bin Laden or whoever this was more power than they really deserve to have. So I think we want to continue to treat this not as a war, but as a terrorist incident, even though the perpetrators of this may see it as a war. We don't want to give them that advantage.
John Parakini, thank you very much for coming in. John Parakini is the executive director of the Washington office of the Monterey Institute. He is writing a book about Osama bin Laden.
We'll be back in a moment with more coverage of today's attacks on New York and Washington, D.C. from NPR News. This is special coverage from NPR News. I'm Noah Adams.
And I'm Linda Wertheimer. We've asked Mr. John Parakini to stay with us for just a few more minutes. John Parakini is executive director of the Washington office of the Monterey Institute, and he's studied acts of terror, including the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. Let me just ask you, if you think you know why this happened, what would be the motive behind such an incredibly serious and large attack against the United States?
It's hard to know what the motive is, and indeed, if we speculate about what the motive is, we're essentially projecting our thinking as to what we think the terrorists are thinking. It's useful to do, but let's recognize the limitations of it. With suicide bombers, it's rare that you get a chance to actually interview them, and we won't get a chance to interview these people. But in previous attacks, and particularly in the World Trade Center bombing, statements that the perpetrators of these crimes made at the end of their trial, some of the things they wrote do give us some idea of what some of the motivations would be. And it's not a single thing. And it's not accurate to say it's all wrapped in religion. It's a variety of things. It's not only an attempt to inflict pain on the United States for its support of Israel. It's not only an attempt to revenge deaths that they feel may have resulted in the Middle East. It's also an attempt to assert their dominance as they see it over Americans. And it affirms who they are. Their sense of powerlessness they overcome by holding the lives of thousands of people in their hands and then crushing them.
In 1993, the first World Trade Center bombing, 6 people died, 1,000 were wounded, and that was bad enough. This could be horrific compared to that. The motive here could be to kill that number of people or to simply see those World Trade Towers topple.
Both. In 1993, Ramzi Youssef did say that he wanted to kill thousands. And in fact, one of the other co-conspirators in that bombing was disappointed that not more people died. This is really a mass casualty attack, and we should focus on that part of the emerging new terrorist threat, that these are people who want to inflict lots of indiscriminate, innocent casualties.
But not with but the means were not as sophisticated as we had feared they might be. Not biological warfare, not nuclear weapons, relatively old-fashioned forms of terrorism, hijacking a plane, a suicide bombing.
Maybe the unusual things that we've been focused on in terms of exotic weapons were not in the right weapons category. These people used an unorthodox way to render mass casualties with a conventional weapon, an airplane.
Thanks very much. John Parakini, Executive Director of the Washington office of the Monterey Institute.
This week on Capitol Hill was supposed to be a time to debate the defense budget. Instead, this morning the Capitol was evacuated and closed down. Lawmakers wondered what the carnage of the day says about America's intelligence capabilities. NPR's Peter Overby reports.
At mid-morning, there was a stunned calm on Capitol Hill. 2 Republican senators and a few staff members stood across the street from the evacuated Capitol and listened to the radio. Chuck Hagel of Nebraska is a Vietnam veteran on the Foreign Relations Committee. John Warner is a World War II vet and ranking Republican on the Armed Services Committee. First, Senator Hagel.
This country has been changed forevermore. This is the second Pearl Harbor. It's that serious. When you think about what has happened here today, it's as serious as what happened at Pearl Harbor. Different kind of an enemy, different time. This is an attack on America.
It's a carefully coordinated attack. It's remarkable, the volume of these things, and I don't know, somehow the intelligence community, I don't know, we'll have to see.
As concerned as Warner might be, he and most other members of Congress are in no rush to second-guess America's intelligence network. A few Democrats pointed out, quietly, that they want to shift some $800 million from Star Wars missile defense to anti-terrorism work. That was supposed to be debated in a committee meeting this morning. But conservative Republican Dana Rohrabacher of California lashed out at what he called the biggest intelligence failure of his lifetime. He blamed the administration of former President Bill Clinton.
We should do a clean sweep. We've got to hold those people who hold cushy jobs in the senior executive level of our well-paid intelligence operations, to sweep them away and do some major reform. We can't just let this get away by saying, oh, there's nothing we could have done. There's a lot we could have done to prevent this, and it's a disgrace that our country hasn't done it.
But Rohrabacher was out on a limb. More typical was Arizona Republican John Kyle on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Like President Bush and many other lawmakers, he talked about protecting the homeland.
It is very unfortunate but true that it takes incidents like this to focus people's attention on the fact that we've got a big job to do in this country, and that's to protect our homeland. A lot of voices have been saying that, but because we appear to be safe and secure, we have other priorities. We need to increase our spending on intelligence. We need to increase our intelligence gathering and analytical capability. We need to increase our ability to infiltrate terrorist organizations. And then we need to have better plans on how to deal with attacks once they occur. It's my hope that this incident, if there's anything good that comes out of this, it will be that it will refocus our attention on this first priority.
For members of Congress, the first priority today was to demonstrate that the congressional branch of government might have been temporarily out of its building, but it isn't out of business. As the tragedy of the day sinks in, the debate over intelligence operations has just begun. Peter Overby, NPR News, the Capitol.
And to review, President George W. Bush spoke from the Oval Office this evening to reassure the nation shocked by today's terrorist attack. He said an investigation has already begun.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance.
President Bush speaking this evening at the White House. Today's events, 4 hijacked airplanes crashing into centers of finance and the military, constitute the largest act of terrorism ever. Search and rescue efforts will continue in New York and at the Pentagon. Numbers of the dead and injured are not yet available, but police in New York say those numbers will be in the thousands. We'll be following the story throughout the night. You're listening to special coverage from NPR News. This is special coverage from NPR News of today's terrorist attacks in New York City and in Washington. In Washington, I'm Noah Adams.
And I'm Linda Wertheimer.
And in New York, I'm Robert Siegel. Today, the United States was hit by the worst terrorist act in history. 4 commercial jets were hijacked and crashed into civilian and military targets, 2 into the World Trade Center in New York City, 1 into the Pentagon outside Washington, D.C. Another plane crashed in rural Pennsylvania, 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Hundreds of people were aboard the planes that crashed, and the death toll could be in the thousands. Moments ago, President George W. Bush addressed the nation from the White House. He said that after the first attack, he implemented the nation's emergency response plan.
Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
President Bush spoke at the White House tonight.
We're joined now by NPR's White House correspondent Don Gagne and our Justice Department correspondent Barbara Bradley. Barbara, let's start with you. What do we know about the investigation that the president has said will be ongoing from this point?
Well, as you just heard, the president said that all of the Justice Department and FBI's and many, many other agencies, actually, all of these resources are going to be deployed. And we are beginning to hear some details. Ashcroft said, Attorney General John Ashcroft said that on one of the planes, the hijackers had knives. Then we know that on another flight, the American Airlines flight that crashed into the Pentagon, we know that the hijackers had knives there. We're beginning to kind of hear little details here and there. But we're going to be seeing a very concerted effort over the next, obviously, round the clock. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be hearing a little bit more about details that come out from, for example, cell phones. Several people made cell phone calls, and so the investigators are going to be talking to the people who received those phone calls, listening to them. They're going to be trying to get clues as to who the hijackers were, trying to trace them to Osama bin Laden or whoever they believe that is. So things are just going to be coming out little by little.
At some level, this is about plane crashes, and there's always evidence about what happened to airplanes. Do you think these investigators have any hope of finding the black boxes?
Well, those black boxes are pretty sturdy. They seem to endure quite a bit. I know that they're going to be looking for them. It's interesting. I was talking to someone a little bit earlier today, and what they said is, there is going to be, yes, it looks like they were all burned up, but there is also going to be a lot of evidence. Not only evidence at the crime scene, but also evidence in other places. For example, they are going to take all those boarding passes and they will scan them for fingerprints. And somewhere in an international database, there may be the fingerprints of the hijackers. They will be looking for things like that, both at the crime scene and off the crime scene.
Where pilots were trained, where they could have found people who might have been able to fly these aircraft.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, it seems pretty clear that the hijackers were also, at least 2 on each plane, were also pilots. The reason is no American pilot would fly into the World Trade Center. So that means that these pilots were trained somewhere, and in all likelihood in the United States or in Western Europe, because the simulators that are needed to train those pilots are in those places. What that probably means is that they are certified and that those pilots are on a list somewhere. So what people think is that they're going to focus on the pilots first.
Don Gagne, the president, spoke to the nation just a few minutes ago. The thrust of what he said.
It was a balance he was trying to strike, that resolve that the United States, that this country will do what it takes to hunt down these people, to proceed with this investigation that Barbara's describing, and then the reassurance to the American public that even though this was a horrible attack on this country's freedoms, that it cannot be viewed as a setback, that this country will not go into retreat, that the federal government will be functioning tomorrow, that the Congress will be in business tomorrow, that the American economy, he said, will be open for business tomorrow.
The president talked about good and evil when he was discussing these hijackers, and he talked about dealing equally with the people who hijacked these aircraft or who planned the hijackings of these aircraft and those who harbor them, which sounds, I assume, like states that have been hiding or permitting the terrorist activity within their borders.
It was probably the strongest language of the president's remarks tonight, that this is not just individuals we are going after. He seemed to be saying that these people have support, and we will find out who is supporting them. And if that is state support, though he didn't use that word explicitly, then there will be repercussions.
Thanks very much, Don.
Thank you.
NPR's Don Gagne, NPR's Barbara Bradley. Thank you both.
You're welcome.
Carrie Nolan is a reporter for member station WNYC, and right now she is in Atlantic Highlands in New Jersey. The harbor there is packed with thousands of people, medical personnel, police, firefighters. Carrie Nolan, I understand that a triage unit has been set up where you are. What's going on there?
Well, right now it looks like medical personnel from practically all over New Jersey have amassed in this very small town on the Sandy Hook Bay. They've set up several tents, triage tents, and they've actually been ferrying people from New York all day long. Mostly this afternoon it's been ambulatory patients who were examined and either treated on the scene or sent to area hospitals. They were also, some of them were sent to decontamination units where they were just hosed down with water to remove asbestos particles that were clinging to their skin and clothing. So this has been sort of an ongoing thing. We're getting word now that more critically injured people are due in on ferry boats probably in about an hour or so.
More
we'll
people,
see what
you
happens
say?
then. I'm sorry?
More people are still coming in?
Yes, sir. More people are coming in, and they're expected to come in probably for most of the night.
Do the people who are running the triage center give any sense to reporters there whether the people they're treating were actually inside the World Trade Center and managed to get out before the explosion, or might they just as easily have been pedestrians in the area at the time?
This afternoon, it was a little of both. There were people who did get out in time, and there were people who just happened to be caught on the street. At this point, they're not even sure how many more critically injured people are coming in. They've just been amassed in one of the meeting rooms here down at the harbor, and some of them are coming out with big boxes of medical equipment. So right now, nobody knows how many people are coming in or how many ferries have been put into work tonight.
But do you get the sense that there actually is an operation at the scene of what were the World Trade Center towers to try to rescue people who might still be alive there.
There is that sense. Everybody's being pretty realistic and not. I don't want to say not holding out too much hope, but just not making any judgments as to who's coming in and where they're coming from, whether it's from the building itself. Right now, the hospitals in New York are just overwhelmed, so this seems to be ferrying people seems to be the most efficacious way of getting people the help they need and to a hospital as quickly as possible.
Well, Carrie, thank you very much for telling us about it. Carrie Nolan of member station WNYC reporting to us from the Jersey side of New York Harbor. She's at Atlantic Highlands in New Jersey.
Here in Washington, rescue crews are at work at this hour at the Pentagon. They're looking for survivors from this morning's attacks and starting the grim effort to recover bodies. NPR's Steve Inskeep joins us from the Pentagon. Steve, the latest there?
No, it appears again that perhaps the fire is under control, at least from our vantage point. Officials earlier in the evening declared this fire to be under control. Up there goes again. Over the last half hour, however, Noah, the fire has begun bursting through the Pentagon roof again and again, a great distance, in fact, from the place where the plane originally struck. And once again, right now, we are seeing tongues of flame licking up into the sky and smoke continuing to rise from the building. As that happens, more rescuers are arriving. They are bringing what appeared to be cadaver dogs, bringing in cranes. Army troops are coming in, convoy after convoy of people to try to begin working through that rubble and see what they can find.
Any estimate about how many people may have been killed in that plane crash?
The Associated Press is giving us a number based from a Pentagon official of perhaps 100, but I have to say, I mean, based on any experience from covering disasters, that's got to be a wild guess at this point. The military is trying to get a handle on how many people really were in the building, asking people to call. One thing that may keep the casualty number lower than it might otherwise have been is that we are told that a portion of the building where the plane struck had been recently renovated and not all the offices were filled.
The question occurs today, why didn't somebody try to shoot down that aircraft as it came screaming into the Pentagon?
Well, I think there are maybe two answers to that, although we're speculating a little here. One, eyewitnesses who've talked to me said this plane flew in very low, which means you would not see it from miles and miles away. You would have a very short time to react and try to get a missile, a shoulder-fired missile, or whatever the Pentagon, whatever the military may have had on the roof to shoot at that. The second thing is, we heard in the newscast at the top of the hour, Noah, that the transponders on these planes were shut off. The transponder is a device on the plane that communicates with the ground, makes it easier to find it on the radar, which means that any early warning radar, any military or civilian radar, would have had great difficulty tracking that plane and getting an early sense that it was heading someplace that it should not have gone.
And at this hour, this evening, what is the military response to this day?
General Hugh Shelton told us, your armed forces are ready. And I think that's the bottom line. Officials made it clear to us that either they do not know yet or are not willing to say yet who they think is responsible for this, but they are prepared, I would presume, to respond with maximum force, not only, as we heard from Don Gagne, against the terrorists if they can be found, but any nation that may have helped them.
Thank you, Steve.
Happy to help.
NPR's Steve Inskeep talking with us from the Pentagon. You're listening to special coverage of today's terrorist attacks from NPR News.